Welcome to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid. A set of conversations about our government, our politics, and the kind of country we aspire to be. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath, on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. Happy Mother's Day weekend. I'm sitting here in Chicago where the Cubs, for the second time, have just won 10 games in a row. That's crazy. There's so much good, but I don't want to sugarcoat the moment we're in. We are witnessing the darkest corner of the American soul, attempting to silence and to cast out our better angels. This is so important. The Republican Party, Donald Trump's party, wants Black communities to have no voice, Black interests to matter not at all, Black political aspirations to be pointless. Look, more than 16% of the people in Tennessee are Black, more than 26% of Alabama, more than 32% of Louisiana. In Mississippi, Blacks make up 37% of the population. Yet Republican leaders in those states are redrawing political maps so that no Black person can be elected without white majority support. When Republicans in Indiana refused to do the same thing, Donald Trump personally made sure they lost their jobs and were replaced by Republicans who would. That's what we have here. Hate, hate, hate. And hate, you know what? Hate always comes to this place. They went after trans kids. It wasn't just that they were worried about the impact of trans kids on sports. That's what they said, but that's not right. It was the kids themselves they went after. No, they can't have health care. No, there is no bathroom they can use. No, they don't belong here. No, they don't belong anywhere, they said. They went after women. They said women can't be trusted to make decisions about their own bodies and banned abortion, sometimes over the objection of voters in their states. They fired women from positions of power in government. And some Republicans are suggesting that households should get one vote, and that vote rightly belongs to the man. Please. They went after immigrants. They broke into homes and schools and hospitals to capture people who had, sometimes for years, been in this country, working, paying taxes, raising American children. But it wasn't really the immigrants they were after. Hundreds of Americans got swept up and imprisoned. The Supreme Court, the Republican partisan Supreme Court, said they could arrest people for being brown or speaking Spanish. The illegitimate Supreme Court said they could be arrested for being brown or speaking Spanish. And the prison camps they are building, the ones they're sending these people to, people are dying in those camps. And now they are rushing to reimpose an old race-based political order across the southern states. My God, look, until recently, codifying racial hate into our political power structure was illegal. Fought a war about this. It was made illegal by the 14th Amendment after our bloody Civil War, a war the North accepted when Southern enslavers sought to expand their power across the continent. As a reminder, the war began when those powerful Southerners lost an election and refused to accept the results. Back then, they didn't storm the Capitol, as we saw during Donald Trump's insurrection on January 6th. No, back then, they just claimed they were a different nation and opened fire on an American base at Fort Sumter to show us they meant it. Well, 4 years later, the Confederacy was a burning ruin, and Mr. Lincoln told us we had a second birth of freedom. But he was murdered by a right-wing vigilante, and for the next 100 years, the 14th Amendment was ignored in the Old South. It took Black soldiers returning home from World War II, heroes who fought for human freedom around the world, returning home to a nation where they were still not free. It took them to launch a new front in this same fight, and 20 more years would pass Bloody years. Years when those who fought for freedom found themselves beaten or dead, lynched, shot, or buried secretly in garbage dumps. Finally, Congress passed and the president signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And in 1968, for the first time, all American citizens of voting age were able to vote in presidential and congressional elections. On our 200th birthday in 1976, we could claim real progress towards realizing our founding promise, that radical idea that all men are created equal. But in this 250th anniversary year of that declaration, John Roberts and the Republicans across America have reneged on that promise, torn it up. The Voting Rights Act no longer functions. The Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department focuses on protecting white men. You can hear this in my voice. I cannot determine for myself whether I am more angry or more disgusted. And we've passed beyond politics. Across American society, our character is being tested, our moral values tried. The political resegregation and coercion we see across the old Confederacy, that is not just a crime, it's a test. That hatred and fear of black men, the crushing possessiveness of women, these are trials. When Pete Hegseth fires black and female officers from our military, it is an examination. The greed and power lust run rampant in Washington isn't a burden we must bear, it's a challenge we must answer. If we don't object, if we don't stand for justice, we fail, not just as a nation, but as human beings. Look, we are on the precipice, whatever metaphor you want, on the edge, something, we're a fork in the road, however you want to say it. But of what? We can turn our backs on the better angels of our history. We can walk away from our great experiment because it was just too hard. And then we'd be like everybody else throughout history, living at the sufferance of those who rule over us. Or we can rise to the challenge of this moment and reclaim our place as a nation and a people dedicated to freedom and equality. This is an old challenge. I mean, human freedom, as you know, is never free. It is a perennial struggle. But that is precisely the struggle that makes Americans American. It is why generations of patriots huddled in the cold of Valley Forge, held Little Round Top during Gettysburg, stormed the beaches in Normandy, endured the blows on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and certified the votes on January 6th. This history is our history, and thank God it is our present too. I saw it on the streets in Chicago and Minneapolis when ICE attacked and we came together to fight back. I can count it in the record number of Americans raising their hands to run for public office right now. I rejoice in it as viewers tune out of a corrupt and politicized CBS News organization. And I meet it every day when I talk to people determined to build a better future, a future not for themselves alone, but for us all. Yes, we are witnessing the darkest corner of the American soul attempting to cast out our better angels. But every day brings powerful evidence of the strength and goodness of those better angels. And I, for one, could not be more grateful than I am to be in this fight and to be in it with you. I have a fabulous show about this dismal week coming. Don't go away.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I have a treat. As you can remember, Holly McCall, she's the award-winning editor of the Tennessee Lookout. She is back with us and back in a moment when there is an incredible firestorm in her state. Holly, thank you.
Well, it's nice to be among sane people.
Well,
Right
let's
now.
hope. Can you describe for everybody what happened in the Capitol in your state this week?
Oh, oh my gosh. Well, so at 4:58 Friday a week ago, the governor called a special legislative session. There's nothing like a Friday afternoon news dump. We all knew that was going to come after President Trump pressed on him to call a redistricting special session. So the legislature convened on Tuesday. We had 3 days of seeing new congressional maps sped through. Republicans continued to say they were pressed by Democrats on, is this racially oriented? This district is predominantly, it's majority black. The answer by Republicans to almost everything was, this is a population and political issue. They refused to acknowledge that it's a majority minority district. At times, they even refused to know if it was I mean, literally, they would say, like, do you know this is a majority minority district? Do you know this is a predominantly black city? Do you know what the percentage of black voters is? And the answer was always, this is done for population and political issues. The Senate sponsor lives about 115 miles away from the city limits of Memphis and went to college there, went to law school there, and said he did not know where the city limits of Memphis were. So Republicans were definitely on the party line. The Democrats, I thought, did just a really fine job of laying their case out. And to hear some of the oratory by Democratic senators, it felt like there was history in the making. Some of these speeches they gave, some of these talks were so powerful and really harkened back to the 1960s civil rights movement. And, we had Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams came in, testified, the former Secretary of State from West Virginia. And all of that was for naught. It sped right through the House and the Senate.
Well, and it does what? What actually
Oh,
passed?
yes. Why, thank you for asking. I am a little tired. Thanks for the prompt. So here's what happened. So this passed on May 7th, which is 89 days, was 89 days from the August 6th primary. What this does is it redraws all of Tennessee's congressional maps. Um, It redraws all of Tennessee's congressional maps. And now Memphis, which was one district, districts are supposed to be drawn based on similar interests. Now Memphis is drawn into three districts, two of which stretch from Memphis in the corner of West Tennessee, right on the Mississippi River, to where I live, Williamson County, which is a 3.5 hour drive away. And it's also the most affluent county in the state. And if that doesn't sound like a lot, it's one of the 10 most affluent counties in the entire nation. It's also where U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn is from, and she will likely be the state's next governor. It is also where the current governor, Bill Lee, is from, and he is also a multimillionaire.
That's you're talking about now Williams County, not Memphis.
Correct. That is correct. And so now, congressional districts are supposed to be drawn on common interest. And that was one of the arguments that was made by Democrats and by opponents of this redistricting over the last week, was that what do people in the middle of urban Memphis have to do either with somebody who lives in Williamson County who is a multimillionaire, because it is a very rich place. I, by the way, am not rich. My parents settled here a long time ago. But at any rate, so what do people in Memphis have to do with either people who are super rich or people who live in this very rural part that circles around in one of the other districts? That is still like very rural, low population. The current U.S. Congressman Steve Cohen, who has represented Memphis for almost 2 years, spoke about that like, hey, I have voted on issues that affect rural populations, but I represent the city of Memphis. And the city of Memphis, the issues that matter to people who are in this city who deal with crime in a different way, for instance, than somebody who lives on farmland. And, it was, I hate to use the term the fix was in, but the Republicans were very disciplined about staying on their message. They never admitted it had anything to do with race. A couple of them did openly say, one kind of slipped out and said that President Donald Trump had the final say on the maps that were drawn, the new maps that were drawn. Boy, I'm sorry this is radio, because I wish you guys could see Edwin's eyes right then when I said that.
Look, Holly, so the Republicans pretended this wasn't about race.
Yeah.
It is entirely about race, and you can't take. I mean, I think Tennessee is. Hang on, I know what this is. Tennessee is give me a second, is 16% black, the population, it's a little over 16% black,
Yeah.
and they're gonna have no representation, zero. That is, that's, it's hard to claim that has nothing to do with race.
So, State Senator Jeff Yarbrough, who is a Nashville Democrat and just is a very, very erudite and well spoken person, here's how he phrased it: 75% of white Memphis is now in one district. 72% of black Memphis is now drawn into two districts. So it splits that 72% up, and it like really dilutes their voice. And of course, I've heard people who say, like, well, I mean, um, well, no, I just lost my train of thought. Ask me a question, Edwin. I'll get back to that.
But I mean, would you describe the anger in the Capitol? What now, not to the legislators, but what did the people who came there, what was that like?
Oh my gosh. Listen, that was, we've had some pretty wild scenes over the last few years. I think the first time you and I talked was 3 years ago when the legislature expelled two black lawmakers. Not that there's a pattern here, but at any rate, so I spent 2 days up in the Capitol. This year we had reporters deployed inside House and Senate chambers, a photographer running around it, and I was sort of out in the middle of the whatever. And the whatever was, you had hundreds of people drive in from Memphis, and that takes a lot of doing. People work. They had to take time off from work. Hundreds of people from Memphis, people from Nashville, people from all over the state. And there was a simmering anger. There was anger, there was hopelessness among some people, deep well of sadness. It was cacophonous in there. I think it was Thursday, the day the maps passed in the House. Somebody had purchased and brought in rape whistles. And so there was this, when the maps passed, there was this like shrieking. I couldn't tell if fire alarms had gone off. In the House, the brother of State Representative Justin J. Pearson, he was one of the black lawmakers who was expelled a couple of years ago and then reelected immediately by his district. He was running for Congressional District 9. His brother was arrested because he did not, they cleared the House gallery. Keyshawn Pearson was like, I'm just sitting here not doing anything. He got arrested. It was wild. It was packed in. There were at least a couple of hundred Tennessee highway patrolmen. They were locked arm to arm in the rotunda of the Capitol. It was hard for me to even get through the state troopers to do my job. Um, and
Somebody burned a Confederate flag?
Yeah, so State Representative Justin Jones had a paper Confederate flag that he pulled out and set on fire after the vote in the Senate.
I'm looking at a text that I got from Justin Pearson, like right before you and I went on the air.
Hmm.
He calls the new map a political lynching. I'm sure you heard a lot of that.
I did. And Justin Pearson, by the way, is a plaintiff in a lawsuit. There've already been 3 lawsuits filed against these maps. And if you don't mind me getting a little off for a second about one of the legal arguments. So 4 years ago, when the last time redistricting was done, it was after the 2020 census. Uh, Republicans countered Democrats about a lawsuit that was filed against those maps and said it's too late in this election cycle to make a change. That was their pushback against this lawsuit. That was in February or March of that year. So now here we are, less than 90 days, less than 12 weeks from the primary election. And so one of the arguments being used, and I can't remember if that's in the Pearson case or if it's in one of the other cases, that says if Republicans used this argument 4 years ago and that was sooner, like pushed out further from the elections, then now here we are, less than 12 weeks before the elections, and they say it's okay. This seems to be a problem. Did I make sense?
No, it made no sense because somewhere in there you are assuming that hypocrisy is not a perfectly legal. I mean, the Supreme Court said you can't do this close to an election, and then they did, right?
Yeah,
So we have this all over the country,
yeah,
right? I mean, we had Mitch McConnell say, no, Barack Obama does not get to appoint a Supreme Court judge because we have an election in a year.
right.
And the voters get to decide. And then we were having an election and Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And he said, what? Like, I don't know, I got like 10 days to get a Supreme Court justice approved. So no, it makes no sense because those rules that you are assuming undergird this don't exist.
Well, thank you for pointing that out. I typically say, and I mostly write commentary as the editor of the Tennessee Lookout. I don't write news stories because they're much better people than me for that. But I like to say I'm on the hypocrisy beat. And that could be a full-time job. Like every single day, I could write about the hypocrisy of this. It's interesting to me. I don't know, interesting is not really the word. Racist, you've got two type of racist. There are people who, I think in a lot of cases, they don't know better. They have not been exposed to education. They've been raised a certain way. They have these sort of assumptions that nobody has broken through. Then you have the people who know better. They know what they're doing is wrong, but they don't want to admit it. And they never will admit that it's about race. But it is. It is. You cannot dilute a majority minority city. And by the way, the congressional district that has been busted up into three now was not drawn through the Voting Rights Act. It was not drawn as a quote majority minority district. It
Mhm.
just happens because that Memphis used to be majority white. Now it's majority black. And it's been represented by two black congressmen since that district was drawn, and Steve Cohen, a white Jewish congressman. So
Since it's become majority black, it isn't just congressional representation that's being stripped away from it. They've also lost control of all kinds of things that normally a local government controls. Talk about that.
yeah, thank you for pointing that out. So this legislative session, the state legislature passed a measure that takes over control of the Memphis Shelby County school system. So now that will be a state appointed board. Um, because of course people from Nashville and East Tennessee know what's best for Memphis schools. By the way, none of the people who made this happen at the legislature have any background in education. So they've stripped that. They've got this Memphis Safe Task Force that is still operating in Memphis. I don't know if I've talked to you, Edwin, since that started up back in the fall. But
No.
for those who don't know, that is a President Donald Trump sort of he wanted Trump wanted this task force here. It is an alphabet soup of the FBI, Drug Enforcement, the DEA, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, and then Tennessee's Governor Bill Lee, who, by the way, I just can't help but point out, was a member of the Kappa Alpha Order fraternity in college, which um, includes Robert E. Lee as part of their whole mission and is based on the Old South, the Lost Cause. Anyway, he sent in the Tennessee National Guard. And so that's all been operating there since the fall. So you've got this going on. You've got the stripping of authority from the Memphis Shelby County school boards. Similar things have happened in Nashville, which is the state's only other majority Democratic city. And it's hard for me to decide if I'm sane, if I'm having a sane day, Edwin. I think this is just because these are Democratic cities. And then when I'm having a not sane day and I put my tinfoil hat on, I have to wonder, why are they so interested in Memphis, which does not produce as much income for the state as Nashville? Nashville is the revenue generator for the state. Memphis, though, it sits on the Mississippi River, which you need a lot of water for data centers, right? There are a couple of Elon Musk data centers there, and I start wondering, why would they focus on this majority black city that just happens to be on this very rich natural resource when they're also permitting these data centers? You can make of that what you will.
Well, what I make of it is that the people who live there don't have any say in those decisions. That we have taken Americans and said, you're second-class citizens. We'll decide what's right for you, and
Yep.
too bad.
Yep, pretty much. I mean, they can still elect their state representatives and their state senators from that area.
Yeah, that's coming too.
Yeah, well,
Your gerrymandering isn't going to stop here.
yeah, I was standing in the elevator bank near the elevators before the session opened on Tuesday, and all the Democrats were out there because they were not going to go up to the House chambers if the Republicans couldn't get a quorum. And I was talking to Representative Harold Love from Nashville. His father was Representative Harold Love Sr., very active in the civil rights movement. So I was talking to Representative Love Jr., and he was like, this is just the start. They're coming for us next because Memphis, almost their entire congressional delegation, 90% of their delegation is black and Democrat. And then 2 or 3 Republicans, and one's already announced his declaration to run for the 9th congressional district. Like literally within 15 minutes of that measure of the new districts passing, he had a press release with the logo, and the fix was absolutely in.
Yeah. So what does this mean um, for the state? And I'm not talking about politics. I'm just talking about like people being able to live together and respect each other and treat each other well. Or does this, I mean, I suspect this is the kind of thing that makes people so angry. And not just like today. This isn't a news cycle story. This is wait a minute, you think we're going back to the days when there are multiple classes of citizens and you rule and we don't have any say about it? I think that creates permanent tension and unrest and anger.
I mean, I would certainly think, I'll tell you, like, I look at this from the outside, sort of the journalistic. And for me, I've studied the civil rights movement very deeply. And I was able to spend a little bit of time around some of these leaders like John Lewis and the Reverend Bernard Lafayette, who ran the Selma Voting Rights Campaign and was almost assassinated. Like he was attacked. He died in March, but I got to spend some time around him, and I'm getting chills thinking about it. And so I am angry. I am angry because you can't know that stuff and see this stuff and see what's happening now and not. I think you can't be angry. But I'm white, and I'm sitting in wealthy Williamson County. If I'm a black Memphian, I would think I can't imagine what rage I think I would feel. And so I yeah, it's astonishing to me how few people even realize that this is going on. It's tuned in people who realize. And I'm going to be interested to see there are several, very excellent black civic organizations in Tennessee. One is called the Equity Alliance, and it formed to start registering black people to vote. They registered 200,000 new voters in, I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2020. It was probably 2018. And I'm going to be interested to see how they gear up to combat this, because I think still one of the few ways to do this, to really combat this, is to get voters to the polls.
I guess I don't know enough about the history of race relations in Tennessee. Sitting up here in cold Chicago, and I'm like, you're in a t-shirt and I'm in a sweater. I never thought of Tennessee like the old Confederacy. I mean, it was South, but it wasn't that kind of South. But maybe I was wrong about that. I mean, tell me about the state and race relations in the history of Tennessee.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up. And everyone else cannot see us, but Edwin can see me smirking, because as soon as he said, I don't know much about the history of race relations in Tennessee, I was thinking, I do. So in Tennessee, people like to say things were not as bad here as they were in Alabama. Alabama and Mississippi get a certifiably and justifiably bad rap. So in Tennessee, the police chief was not pulling out fire hoses and German shepherds attacking people. But that does not mean that Tennessee was not a Jim Crow state. The lunch counter sit-ins, the first one happened in Greensboro, North Carolina. But Nashville, Tennessee was a hotbed of those sit-ins and launched the careers of John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and the late James Bevel, Diane Nash, who became a leading figure in the civil rights movement. And so I have a friend from Memphis who writes for the Tennessee Lookout. His name is the Reverend Earl Fisher, and he describes it not as Jim Crow, but as James Crow Esquire, which you may or may not have heard. It's a little bit more of a subtle and polished version than it was. And, I'm 61. When I started school in 1969, the year of 1969, 1970, my schools were still segregated. So just because we didn't look as ugly and brutal on the outside doesn't mean there hasn't been plenty of discrimination over the years here.
How did Al Gore ever get elected in that state?
Well, he did for a while, and then there was 2000 when he lost his home state.
Yep, he did.
And to be clear, because Republicans like to point out that it used to be that Democrats were the segregationists and the racist, and that's true. It is true.
That's
The, Dem-
absolutely true.
the Democrats after the
Abraham Lincoln was a Republican.
That's correct. And I think many of your listeners will already know this, but when Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 65, he said, "There goes the South for the next 50 years." Well, here we are 60 years later, and the South is still gone because what we saw are people who were racist were Democrats until the Democrats became more supportive of giving black people the right to vote. And then they migrated, and the Republican Party played into that. They saw an opportunity. Richard Nixon had the Southern strategy that was to pick off white Democratic voters, and he did. And we've seen the Republican Party continue to move that way.
Well, um, it the, when you start to have politics of hate and animosity, it doesn't ever end with one group. The this current session of your legislature also saw a whole lot of anger in the LGBTQ community.
We barely covered that this year, Edwin. We usually cover uh, LGBTQ plus advocates call it the slate of hate. And the first time I really noticed this was in 2016. There were a couple of anti-LGBTQ bills, and those have continued every year. And every year, I think, what more can they do to this community? And they find ways
More
to do
things.
things. And I don't know if this is on your list. We can also talk about the Immigration 2026 agenda, which Tennessee lawmakers openly talked about. They crafted that with Stephen Miller, who is the architect of Donald Trump's anti-immigration.
I know Stephen Miller, but tell me about this plan. I don't know about this.
Well, I'm just so glad I can bring so much good news to your listeners. So they called it Immigration 2026, and it included bills that have now been signed into law. One that says any commercial driver, if you want a commercial driver's license, you have to prove your citizenship. Now, look, there was something already in place to do that, right? But now you have to go back. Even if you already have a commercial driver's license, you again have to go in and take papers. Like you have to take your papers, which I'm not going to point out what that sounds like, but we all know what that sounds like.
It sounds like America in the Trump years. That's what it sounds like.
And a few other things, almost 100 years in the past. So there's that one. There's one that says that immigrants cannot get any services from any public agency. So even the public health department, this is, I think, a really important one to note. If you are sick as a dog and you are an immigrant who is here without full legal status, if you go to a public health department, you cannot be treated if you are not a citizen. Or if you get treated, then the people treating you who work there can be arrested for treating you. Yeah. If you were an immigrant without full legal status and you go to an emergency room, emergency rooms are required by law to treat you, right? So they will treat you, but then they have to report that they treated somebody who is not here with full status.
So they have to set up the capacity to determine somebody's citizenship
Right.
as they treat them. That's an extra cost too.
Right.
Sure. Healthcare is really going to like that. It's not.
Yeah.
So they've said these immigrants are non-people. They don't count. They can't do anything, but they still allow them to pay taxes, don't they?
Well, yeah, obviously. However, that's one of the big talking points from Tennessee Republicans is they don't pay taxes, so they shouldn't get services, which is, I mean, are you really that stupid? If you buy groceries, you pay taxes. And by the way, Tennessee has one of, if not the highest grocery tax in the United States. Many states don't tax groceries. Tennessee taxes groceries, and measures by Democrats and Republicans to either reduce or repeal the grocery tax have failed. Which is all of which say is like
That's interesting. Well, why? I mean, that impacts everybody. Why is that a tax that's so high there?
I don't have the answer to that. And it does affect everybody, but obviously that's going to have a much worse effect on low income. If you were a family,
Sure, it's a very regressive tax.
right,
It's a
with
very
4
regressive
kids,
tax.
it's not going to affect you as much as a family that makes $40 or $50,000 a year. I know I've taken us down the pathway of all the bad legislation, Edwin.
Well, then let's take a minute on something that isn't legislation. And why don't you tell everybody about Andy Ogles?
Oh boy. So
Now, I wish everybody could see your face.
Oh boy. So Andy Ogles is the sitting U.S. representative for the 5th Congressional District. The 5th Congressional District used to be Nashville. It got busted up 4 years ago in much the same way Memphis has. So Ogles represents a part of Nashville. He and I graduated from the same high school, although many, many years apart. His professional background is he and his mom owned a donut shop in Franklin, Tennessee that went out of business after a couple of years. When he ran for office, he said he had a background in law enforcement, and it turned out that he had been, I don't know, he like helped park cars for the Williamson County Sheriff's Department. That was his law enforcement. He said he led international efforts to crack down sex trafficking. That was not true. He said he had a degree in economy from a local university, and he did not. He took one course in economics, economics, not economy. He said he had a degree from Vanderbilt University's Owen School of Management, and he did not. He took like a weekend certificate course. Anyway, so he's in Congress. The FBI seized his telephone after the last election because he's had been investigated for campaign finance fraud and corruption ever since he got elected in 2022. That investigation just shut down, and he got his phone back. He's also been notable for being very, very pro Trump, and very anti Muslim. And recently went online and said that there's no place for Muslims in America and that pluralism is a lie. He recently did a talk at Nashville's Belmont University, which, by the way, is no bastion of liberalism. For years and years, it was part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now it's not officially. It's still a fairly conservative school. And so he invited himself to speak to the Belmont College Republicans and got owned by many of the kids there who were not all college Republicans. And then he, went out and said that these very bright college students were a bunch of 3-year-old toddlers. And he's running for office again. He did have some pretty significant competition, but that district has also been redrawn, and I'm betting he gets reelected comfortably. Welcome
Okay,
to the
so
state.
like that guy who was who Congress threw out, the liar in New York, he's making everything up. Um, and he says pluralism is a lie, and he says there's no place in America for Islam. So race and intolerance have nothing to do with what's going on in Tennessee. Sure, that's right. That's yeah.
Well, I wish I could say that he was the only person who says things like that about Muslims, but he's got plenty of company in the Tennessee General Assembly. Plenty of company.
Is there a large Muslim population in Tennessee?
No,
So why is everybody so worried?
because like Edwin, you're teeing that up for me because you already know the answer. It's an election year talking point. Just like we had caravans and hordes of migrants coming a few years ago. Muslims are this year's election talking points.
Okay. By the way, when I said that, I want to just be really clear. There are very few Muslims in the state, so they have nothing to worry about. But they'd have nothing to worry about if there were a lot of Muslims in the state, because it turns out there's nothing wrong with being a Muslim.
Yeah, there's not. There's
No,
not.
yeah.
There's
So
not. But
yeah. But you have a Speaker of the House saying, "Oh my gosh, we have not your house, the House in Washington, saying we have to worry about Sharia law in America or something ridiculous like that."
Yeah, well, that's been a big deal in Tennessee for years. There was a state representative years ago. This is like sort of a light note of racism, I guess. Several years back, we had a state representative who went just ballistic and told the news media that he had found that it was already Sharia law was upon us, that he walked into a bathroom and he saw a Muslim foot washing sink in a legislative bathroom. It was a mop sink to wash the janitor's mops in. So
Okay. And by the way, clean feet are probably not a crime, but whatever.
there probably aren't that many clean feet in the Tennessee General Assembly,
It's
and I
certainly not clean hands.
don't Badoom.
I want to go back to Memphis for a second because it's now helpless, divided, politically weak. Um, who controls the police force there? Do the people in Memphis?
I mean, technically, I guess
I
they
mean,
don't.
did they really pepper spray peaceful protesters on a No King's Day?
Yes, I watched lots of video from that, and that seemed to be the only march in the country where there was any sort of violence. And again, like I watched video from a bunch of different angles, and yes, they pepper sprayed people who were just marching along. They pepper sprayed marshals. I talked to one of the event marshals, or the people who wear the yellow vest and try to keep
Hmm.
everything in line and
Hmm.
buffer, the marchers from the cops. And I talked to him, and he got pepper sprayed, and just for no real reason. Later, I'm sorry, I have a dog that just barked in the background, folks. But later, the cops came out and said, "Oh, they didn't have a permit to march. It was just a gathering permit." Well, why did you wait until why did you let it go on? Why did you wait until it was
Wait,
ending?
wait, because they didn't have a marching permit, they were pepper spraying them?
Yeah, that's the yes. I know none of it makes sense, right? Also, they were literally 100 feet from the very end of the march. They were at a public park when they got pepper sprayed. So, I mean, it clearly doesn't make any sense. And anybody who's got any critical thinking skills at all knows it's a bunch of BS.
All right, so you wrote about the various attacks on Memphis, and your piece, you went biblical, you went plagues. And I just,
I like to
the
roll out
moral
some old.
imperatives of this time we're in bring out that kind of language. I think it feels like you have to write that way to talk about the moment we're in.
Well, I like to roll out a little bit of Old Testament in Tennessee sometimes because we have some folks here who seem to believe that the New Testament is the only thing that exists. But also, you know, so many Republicans seem to think that anybody who is not a hardcore Trump Republican is not a Christian or does not believe in the Bible.
You
And
mean like the Pope?
right, right, exactly.
Yeah.
And listen, brother, I said my big fanny has spent a whole lot of time sitting in pews at the Methodist Church, and that column just like all the stuff that's going on there. Seriously, you've got XAI, the Elon Musk data center, that is polluting, by the way, a traditionally black neighborhood of Memphis. That's got a lot of chemical companies there. Hey, not anything to do with race. So yeah, I just thought, that gum, man, these poor people.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like as you talked about before with some of those speeches that made you think of the civil rights movement in its most precarious days, that calls for a language that's not the one you and I have been speaking most of our lives,
Mhm.
calls for the kind of heightened moral rhetoric that we didn't think we'd have to use.
Edward, you are so good. You are so good at pointing that out because, I've had a couple of Republican lawmakers. One said to me, "You think you have the moral high ground?" And my response to him, and this was a couple of years ago, I said, "I do. On some things, yes, I do. And if you don't see that, I can't make you see that." But it seems to me that it is objectively wrong to look at a city that is comprised of, I don't know, 75 or 80% African American, and to cut that up and divide that into districts with people who have no common interest. Congressional districts are supposed to be drawn on common interest. And if
Well,
you
how
don't,
about, I mean, you take it away from it. Like, okay, you took the power, you have it. How about funding their schools? How about making people's lives better? How about making sure that people have a chance to grow up here and have the kind of future that you have? That would be a decent thing to do. It's yours, it's your responsibility now, but you won't do that because you don't love the people you represent.
well, there's some willful ignorance, and we don't have time to get into our school situation, but Tennessee does fund public schools. We are last in the nation in funding. And then Republicans say, "Oh, public schools are not functioning well. Let's create an entire system of charter schools and give out school vouchers and give out state money so people can send their kids to private schools."
Yes, I know that. Ohio went through that. It was the second biggest corruption scandal in the state's history,
Right.
right? I mean, Ohio did me a favor in Illinois by becoming more corrupt than we are. It was a great
Well, we're
way.
well on our way. Look, people often undervalue Tennessee, right? And they undervalue our governor. They like to talk about how bad Greg Abbott is and how bad Texas is, and they talk about how bad Florida and Ron DeSantis is. People do not sleep on Tennessee and do not sleep on Governor Bill Lee, who, again, he is more of the James Crow Esquire. He is not openly, he doesn't have this rhetoric. He seems nice. You ask him a question, "Oh, I don't know the answer to that. Oh, I don't know if that's the case." And I would not be shocked if he does not run for president down the road. So we have plenty of our own simmering issues here, some not so simmering, some out front. Do not sleep on Tennessee. It ain't all Dollywood
I'm
and
not sleeping on Tennessee. I'm not sleeping on K Ivy. I mean, we got a bunch of this. But like, do you see the people of Tennessee growing tired of all this uh, coercion from the government?
I think eventually, but I don't know when. The moral arc of the universe is long. I mean, I think it's going to have to come. So much of this is around Trump, right? And so average gas prices are now over $4.50. I think people are going to have to get hit in the pocketbook. Tennessee has voted for Trump by more than 64% each election he's run in, and each election runs in, he gets a higher percentage of the vote in Tennessee. And so I think it's going to have to come when people can't afford to buy their groceries. And
Well, so how do they think about that? I mean, what do they think about the Iran war? What do they think about gas prices? And I mean, are they blaming somebody other than Trump for this?
I don't hear much at all about the Iran war here. I do hear, and I don't think that's, I would guess most people are thinking about what's going on with them and their wallet and not so much about what is going on overseas. And they might not even necessarily connect. And I don't mean this in a negative or pejorative way. They might not even necessarily connect what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz with their gas prices. But eventually, if these gas prices continue to rise or if they don't go down, grocery prices are very high. I think there's an eventuality. I know from history that things eventually do change. They correct themselves. I just don't know how long that's going to take. Like, are public schools going to get worse? Even if you qualify for a school voucher, which most everybody can, there might not be a school in your area. There aren't any private schools in rural areas. So school vouchers don't do people in rural areas any good.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
I don't think things correct themselves, Holly. I think we have to correct them.
Okay.
You know, I mean, we got some responsibility here.
We do. I mean, I think the way to look at that is as people become angrier over some of these pocketbook issues, they may take steps to correct themselves. But
Mm,
I don't see that happening in Tennessee in the next couple of years.
not yet. Wow. Well, I'm reminded that the Civil War began. There were a lot of causes, but it began when some very rich, very powerful interests in the South refused to accept the results of a presidential election. Right? I mean, been there, right? They didn't storm the Capitol. They just said, "No, we're taking our chips and forming," and then they've different country, and then they stormed Fort Sumter. So
Mhm.
the same idea, but it was bad for us then. It's bad for us now. We got to. I mean, the Democrats got their butts kicked the last cycle, and not one of them said it was a fraud. It's not,
Well,
some people want to have a country together. I mean, at some point, uh, a whole chunk of the country on the other side is going to say, "Fine, take your states."
as a matter of fact, there's already one Memphis lawmaker who has suggested that Memphis secede from Tennessee.
Yeah, that can't. Well, good luck with that. That'll
Yeah,
end worse than the other secession.
the question was, where are you going to go to Arkansas with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, or are you going to go to Mississippi with Tate Reeves, or is Reeves still the governor? I don't even know who the governor is there. Or are you going to try to form your own little state of Memphis, which I wouldn't blame them for wanting to do, but since the state's cut off all your money, like anyway,
Yeah, well, look how it worked for Washington D.C. wanting to be a state.
yeah.
Yeah, no, having people with no representation is not out of line here. All right, well, tell me some good news from your state, please.
Good news. You know, there were a few positive bills that passed this legislative session. Every year I'm asked, what good happened in the legislature? And I am left fumbling for words, but I prepared this year. There were a couple of good environmental measures, which
Huh.
there's also not a lot of good environmental measures passing in Tennessee. We love to give away like any kind of like mineral rights or stuff. But there are a couple of really treasured rivers in Middle Tennessee, in the center part of the state. One is called the Duck River. It is literally one of the most biodiverse rivers in the United States. They have a wide variety of freshwater mussels, and the governor actually has worked on providing protections for that, and some legislation passed that would prevent landfills from going next to these protected rivers. Landfills need water. There's a company that wants to site a huge landfill right next to the Duck River, and it's also on property that was formerly owned by Monsanto Chemicals. Hey, not going to be anything leaching into the river from that. So there were a few measures to protect rivers. One is a national park. One of the rivers in East Tennessee that is protected by this is a national park property. And so, those are little things, but those are good things.
Yeah.
And, yeah, that's what's going on. That's what's
And,
going
and
on.
um, uh, life in the state, most people are ignoring what's going on in government, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
even with this enormous um, outpouring in the state capitol, but 2 days later, most of the people that you run into are like, "What? Like, what is it?"
Yeah, but I think, not that many. I don't know what the percentage is, but people like you and I, Edwin, and your listeners, we pay attention to what's going in government at the federal level and at our state level. I think most people are just trying to get through life.
Hmm.
Most people are trying to feed their kids, get through their workday, pay the bills. And some people just don't care because their lives are so great they don't have to. So, but I think most people, it's not out of this maliciousness. They don't read the Washington Post. Well, I don't read the Washington Post anymore, but they don't read the New York Times, and they're
Sure,
not
sure, sure.
in.
But
Uh,
well, that's why you're there trying to help them,
well,
get to know what's going on in the state,
you know,
and uh, people who are supposed to be sovereigns of their own state can't really do the
right,
job if they're ignorant.
right.
So it helps to get to know what's going on. But the stuff that they are paying attention to, isn't that getting harder rather than easier?
How so?
When I talk to young people, no matter where they are, they're like, when am I ever going to be able to get a home? When am I ever going to be able to have children? Life is hard. Life is scary. There are too many unknowns all at once
Right.
coming at us.
Again, like you mentioned young people, and hear more of that concern from young people than I do people our age, because we're set, right? Like I'm privileged. I live in a house my great grandfather bought in 1890, and they just didn't. I mean, at the time they didn't move out and get a house with central air conditioning because they couldn't afford that. But now it's great, right? It's this historical property.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it's the young people who are really struggling, but they also don't vote. Still, young people do not vote, and the way we're set up, it's a flawed system, and it's even more flawed all the time. But if you're not going to go vote on who's running for office, like you're definitely not going to make any change. I just don't see, like, what
Yeah.
other options do we have? Violent overthrow? That's not going to work. I
No,
don't advocate for that.
no.
Nobody with any sense advocates for that.
So I know this about other states, North Carolina, Ohio, even Indiana, for the first time in that I can remember, Democrats are running in districts all over the state. They're finally running for state house and state rep. In places they won't win, but they're carrying the flag. They're out there talking to people. They're saying, there's another candidate in the race. He's going to win, but he's going to lie to you for the next month. Let me at least counter that. That's happening. Is that happening in Tennessee? Are they
Not so much.
not so much? Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the Tennessee Democratic Party, there's so much infighting. They're fighting over nothing. There's no power. Tennessee Democrats have zero power, and the state Democratic Party has been involved in so much infighting over the last few months. Um, I don't even see as many candidates running for state house as I have in past election cycles.
Yeah, that's terrible.
It is terrible, and I mean, and this is not all the state Democratic Party's fault, right? But Tennessee, there's a story to be written and will be written about the fact that before this happened, for sure, and I still think Democrats will do fairly well in U.S. House in the midterms across the country. And Tennessee, I will be shocked even before this redistricting happened. I would have been shocked if we flipped any seats, state house or congressional, state senate. I don't think a seat flips. I don't didn't think a seat flipped 2 months ago before all of this went down.
Hmm.
And
Well,
yeah,
that's cold water. That's
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No,
It's
I'm
out
glad to
there.
hear it. So, because talk to these organizations like Run for Something,
Mhm.
which has fielded an unbelievable number of candidates this year, but Tennessee is not where that's happening.
No, and I think a lot of it is for the last decade or two, even the National Democratic Party has given up on the South, except for Georgia and North Carolina. I mean, they've given up on Tennessee. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, I will say, got involved in this election cycle to support a candidate who is or was running against Andy Ogles. I don't even know what district he's in now. His name is Chaz Mulder, and he's the mayor of Columbia, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. Um, good candidate, seems popular, has raised something like $1.8 million to
Mm-hmm.
Andy Ogles, $135,000.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also a plaintiff on one of these lawsuits. And so the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has gotten involved and supported him. But
Yeah, well, it's the other Democratic Party that's stirring around the country, the bottoms up one, not the money Washington one,
right,
because they are playing a different game. And
right. And I'm not sure what that one is, but we don't have a bottoms up here. I mean, there is a bottom up, but there's not enough yet.
yep, that's
I don't
interesting.
I don't want to take away from the boots on the ground activists who are out there like really trying to recruit people to run for county commissions and local
Mm-hmm.
boards.
Mm-hmm.
That some of that is going on, but it's going to be a very long game in Tennessee.
Okay, so you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, sorry for that cold water there, Edwin.
No, listen, we've run through our time together.
Okay.
As always, it goes by fast. Thank you, Holly. I really appreciate it.
Oh, nice to
Um,
see your face. Thanks for
Nice to
having
see
me
you. Nice
on.
to meet your dog.
There are a couple of them back here.
I got one down the floor.
Is it
So
Tennessee if you don't have a couple of hound dogs lying
I
around?
got to hang on the floor here. So yeah,
Oh,
yep,
good to see you, buddy. Thank
yep.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, everybody, we'll be back in just a second after the news. Again, Josh Orton, I think, is next. It'll be fabulous. It's recorded and it's a great conversation.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I apologize. Right before the break, I had my schedule confused. We'll get to that other interview later. Right now, I'm joined by Brian Lyman, who's the editor of the Alabama Reflector, and we just went through a heck of a conversation about Tennessee.
Yeah.
Gird thy loins, as you say. This one's not going to be any better.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm almost not sure where to start in Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote about the Supreme Court's war on Southern democracy. I love that piece. But I want to start here because I read today, right before I went on the air, that the Speaker of the Alabama House, a guy named Nathaniel Ledbetter, told reporters that he hoped the Supreme Court would overturn the 14th Amendment. Now, I got a lot of thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm.
And Supreme Courts don't overturn the Constitution. That's not their job. And I wonder whether when you get elected in Alabama, don't you raise your hand and swear to support the Constitution? I mean, what the hell?
We were there for that, and I'm going to say that was probably a he misspoke, because after a few minutes later, one of the reporters in the room said, "Wait, are you saying you want to repeal the 14th Amendment?" And he backed down pretty quickly from that, tried to clarify that. So
he just wants to ignore it, not repeal.
Right. But I think that is, in some ways, that is the history of Alabama. They want to ignore the Reconstruction amendments, and the state has moved heaven and earth to do that for 125, even let's say 150 years. We live under a constitution that was designed specifically as a response to a populist Republican alliance in the 1890s that came very close to toppling the dominant Bourbon Democratic regime. It was a constitution passed. It was the convention itself was convened through fraud. The president of the convention said, "We are here to establish white supremacy within the confines of the Constitution." And
forgive me, you're talking about the Alabama Constitution.
The Alabama Constitution, correct? Yes. And then that Constitution was sent out to voters. It was not popular because unfortunately, the state, there were not enough voices to challenge Black disenfranchisement, but there was also disenfranchisement for poor whites, which everybody noticed and most people opposed. And again, Constitution was passed through fraud. The key thing to understand about Alabama, and I think any state Southern government, is, like you look at Illinois, and I know Illinois, obviously, state government there has its share of issues. One of the things, though, that's key to any government, whether it's Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, north of the Mason-Dixon line, is that there is some expectation that the government is going to represent the people there. That is not the expectation. That is not the foundation of Southern government. Southern government was founded essentially to protect the men who held men, women, and children in bondage, give them every scope possible to maintain that, give them any power to do that. So government, however imperfectly in the North, serves the people. Government in the South serves the elites. Like Alabama, when Alabama has anything, it basically comes from the federal government, whether it's voting rights or whether it's the Tennessee Valley Authority. Like Alabama never did anything like, like let's say like in Illinois, there was never anything in Alabama equivalent to the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Like what government exists here exists to protect the powerful.
Well, you did build a pretty good university.
My wife works for one of those universities, so yeah, we're proud of that. Yeah.
I mean, that's not nothing. I mean, right now that's under attack too around the country.
Yes, yeah, and even in Auburn too. Yeah, and we've written about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So that's a really depressing start. So talk a little bit. I mean, Alabama is, I think, 26% Black.
Right, 26% Black. Yeah.
Right. So where do those people get representation?
So Alabama's district lines right now are drawn not just at the congressional level, but even at the state level and at the State Board of Education level. They're essentially drawn to reflect the number of Black Alabamians within the population. So if you were to look at the Alabama House and the Alabama Senate right now, the Democratic caucus in both chambers is overwhelmingly Black. It's also roughly the proportion of Black Alabamians in those chambers is about 25, 27%, depending on how you do the math. So and that's essentially to keep in line with the Voting Rights Act, or at least the Voting Rights Act as it was understood in prior to Louisiana. Yeah, right. That was typically like how it was done. There have been many obstacles put up to Black voting. I mean, obviously Shelby County versus Holder, the 2013 Supreme Court ruling, that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that also came out of Alabama. That came out of a suburb south of Birmingham. So any kind of power that Black Alabamians have is essentially a legacy of the Voting Rights Act and a legacy of the civil rights movement, which is why, if you saw the protests that took place in and around the State House this week, there were enormous invocations of that history and that memory. There were people who were, there were people beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge who came to speak. There were people who faced Bull Connors, fire hoses, and the dogs who came to speak. Mary Moore, who's a Democratic representative from Birmingham, was one of those children who marched in 1963. That is the only guarantee that we have of democracy in this state. It comes from the federal government. And when the federal government pulls the rug out from under those protections, that's when Alabama gets in trouble. I mean, you can go back to, obviously, we know what happened with Louisiana versus Calais, but we also know, there's unfortunately a shameful history before the Warren Court of the Supreme Court doing this. Back in 1902, a postal worker named Jackson Giles challenged the Alabama Constitution, with the backing of Booker T. Washington, all the way to the Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote an opinion basically saying that, yes, you're right, this takes away your rights, and no, there's nothing we're going to do about it. That's the kind of thing, if Alabama does not have those federal protections, the people who run Alabama will take those protections away, because Alabama government is not meant really to be a democracy. It's meant to have the forms of a democracy, but its real purpose is to ensure that a few powerful people have the scope to act as they would like.
Brian, you phrased that as if the federal government no longer backstops civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
There is no if. The federal government is no longer in that business.
Right.
The Supreme Court doesn't believe in it and has gutted the laws, the civil rights, the great civil rights laws of this country. And the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department has been told to focus on the rights of white men.
Mhm.
So that's it. So there is no if. So what do you expect to happen?
Well, there is. So the one thing that bailed us out earlier in this decade was, as you might know, Alabama had a second. They call it an opportunity district. It's not a majority minority district. I think it's like 48, 49% black district, currently represented by Shamari Figures, who lives in Mobile. When that case went to the Supreme Court, everybody was convinced that this is going to be a dead issue. We're just going to have a 6-1 Republican Democratic map. What bailed out democracy in the state was that the state put on a terrible case, like an absolutely garbage. Samuel Alito actually had to intervene to try to help the attorney who was trying to argue on behalf of the state. Now we have one of the things that we're going to be watching, obviously, for the next few days is that if you look at the Calais ruling, Alito said that this does not apply to Allen versus Milligan, which was the case that set up Alabama's second opportunity district, as it were. The Milligan plaintiffs are leaning in on that, like just pointing out this language. A lot of Democrats pointed that out repeatedly during the week. Like, this special session that we just had, it really didn't do redistricting. It set up like primary elections should the courts allow them to redistrict. Now, do I underestimate the Supreme Court's willingness to contradict itself when it can advance some kind of conservative power? Absolutely not. I would not be shocked if they say, well, no, actually, sorry, we were just kidding. Like Milligan actually does come under this. But it also seemed like this was the same approach that Alabama had when they were trying to overturn Milligan in 2023. They had this naive hope that they could convince Brett Kavanaugh to like switch his vote and change his mind on that, which was a terrible, terrible legal strategy. And the courts all said that this is a terrible strategy. So, there's a fine, unique mixture in Alabama of malevolence and incompetence. So one of the things you might hope is that like the latter wins out over the former.
Well, certainly they'll run out of time before the next election.
They're getting there. I think like the drop dead deadlines are like late August or something, but we already have a primary election set for May 19th. The laws that they passed this week would allow special primary elections to be scheduled. But then there's another issue there, which is Alabama voters in 2022 approved a measure that says you can't change the election laws within 6 months of an election. That deadline this year was May 3rd. The special session began on May 4th, so they seem to be in violation of the Alabama Constitution. Now, Republicans argued throughout the week that law meant general elections, not primary elections. I think that's a weak argument, but I will see what the courts do on that.
The state Supreme Court.
Yeah, right. That would probably go to the state Supreme Court, which is a 9-0 Republican body. So I wouldn't hold my breath with those folks.
In this context, let's turn to the Southern Poverty Law Center. Mm-hmm. First, tell everybody what it is, and then what the controversy is.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded in 1971. It can be best described as a civil rights nonprofit / law firm, I guess, which is the best way to define it for most of its history. It made its name suing Ku Klux Klan organizations around the South, bankrupting them. In 1987, they successfully sued the United Klans of America, who lynched a 19-year-old Mobile student in 1981, basically drove them into bankruptcy. Since then, SPLC has stood for many progressive causes, labor. It was involved heavily in litigation against Alabama's anti-immigration bill in the 2010s. It monitors hate groups throughout the country. I will say this before we get to the case itself. I will say SPLC has had some historic issues, like particularly with treatment and promotion of minority employees in the organization. It's employees organized a few years ago, formed a union, and SPLC management hired a union-busting law firm to try to dissuade them. So I say that just to say that this is not necessarily like an unblemished lamb. That said, last month, the Department of Justice brought criminal charges against SPLC, claiming that, as a way of background, one of the ways that SPLC disrupted these Klan groups was by paying informants within the organizations, basically when SPLC did this in the late 70s and early 80s, there were serious concerns about Klan violence. Obviously, Michael Donald's lynching in Mobile in 1981 was a major one. So SPLC paid these people within these groups to essentially monitor like their interstate activities, which they would pass on to the law enforcement and whatnot. The fact that SPLC was using informants, that's been known since like 1986. The fact that they were paid informants, that's been known since 1994. DOJ's argument in this lawsuit is that by paying these informants, the SPLC was effectively enriching the white extremist groups that they were disrupting and essentially perpetrating a fraud on their donors. Now, if you did not know SPLC was an anti-Klan group by 1987, seriously, like, you don't have a grip on reality here. Like, they were consistent about it. I mean, Morris Dees, one of the co-founders of the SPLC, I saw him speak at Fordham University, my alma mater, in the mid-90s, talking about like their lawsuits against this. So the case itself is utterly and completely absurd. The SPLC was arraigned in court this week. They pled not guilty. I mean, there's another whole issue about arraigning a nonprofit, which is but I'm not a lawyer. That's way beyond my scope of things. However, SPLC has also been demanding the grand jury transcripts that DOJ used to indict them, that they're claiming that DOJ misled the grand jury. There is really, it's simply an absurd charge. There is no universe in which SPLC was ever an ally of, take your pick, the KKK, neo-Nazis, like whatever have you. I mean, that's literally absurd. And SPLC even worked very hard to protect these informants because they knew that they were going to probably get killed if their buddies found out what they were doing. So it's just simply another absurd prosecution. I think, the one thing you can say about the Southern Poverty Law Center is that they have incredible resources to defend themselves. So they are not simply, I don't think they're just going to knuckle under and let this case go without a serious fight.
Yeah, well, around the country, many people don't think it's about them at all. It's just to chill anti-racism organizations everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Which is probably true. It's just that and I hope people will. I hope people will, and I understand that a lot of groups do not have the resources that SPLC does. The one thing I would suggest folks who may be scared look at is this DOJ's track record when it comes to bringing these prosecutions, because it's not great at all. I mean, the courts, for not everywhere, but at least at the medium and lower levels, the courts are holding firm, for the rule of law.
Yeah. Well, all right. So just we now have this. We now no longer have really a Voting Rights Act. We have institutions that have long been guardians of civil rights under attack from the federal government. That's a new reality in America. And it's one that will make zero difference in Illinois. It'll make zero difference in lots of states where we will continue to fight for the civil rights of the people who live in our states, and won't engage in this. It won't use the retreat of the federal government as an opportunity to impose coercive rule on our people. But you're suggesting that that's going to happen in Alabama and in other states of the former Confederacy.
Yeah. Like what we need is it's going to take a lot of coalition building and kind of a revival of the local just the local infrastructure to kind of like start bringing the pressure to restore some of these laws. I mean, the one thing I would say though is what we saw at the State House this week was very impressive. One of the key, when we just talk about politics, one of the key problems that the Alabama Democrats have had over the last several years is that their voters have not been turning out. In the 2024 election, the Democratic vote totals were about 10% lower than they were in 2020. Now, some of that is due to a lack of competitive races. Some of that is due to Alabama making it much more difficult to vote than it really should be by any baseline.
Let me ask you about that. Let me ask you about old-fashioned voter suppression.
Mhm.
Is it true that in mostly Democratic counties, the polling places move and people don't know about them? They show up to vote and wait a minute.
Yes, sometimes. So that's happened in the past. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's like a genuine attempt at voter suppression and whether it's a reflection of population. One of the issues with the black counties that we see here is that many of them are aging rapidly and the population is dropping quickly. Like Perry County, which is just south of Tuscaloosa, they lost 20% of their population just between 2010 and 2020. So, like I don't want to say you've got to give them the benefit of the doubt, but there are certainly other factors.
Is that population decline? Well, first off, about Democrats and Republicans in your state. Is that line entirely race? I mean, are there like almost no white Democrats and almost no black Republicans in your state?
You could basically describe it as a racially polarized electorate.
Wow.
Black Alabamians tend to vote for Democrats, and white Alabamians tend to vote for Republicans. The one exceptions that we're seeing are like kind of like around the Huntsville area where there's a lot of folks moving in from like, say, like Northern Virginia and places like that where the electorate looks a bit more like what you would expect nationwide. But yes, that's not just me talking. That's the federal courts saying that we find that voting is racially polarized in the state of Alabama. Yeah.
Okay. Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So the decline in population in the counties you're talking about is because of an aging population dying, or is there also once again migration out of the state?
It's not necessarily out of the state, although I'm certain there's people going to Atlanta and like those areas as well. But what you tend to see is there's one state senator who represents a Western Alabama district, and we spoke to him a few months ago, and he said all his constituents are moving up to Tuscaloosa. What's the reason? There are jobs in Tuscaloosa. Like when you look at the Black Belt, there are some parts of it that are like third world countries when it comes to poverty. Wilcox County, especially, is like notorious for that. We had sewage issues in Alabama, and we still do in the Black Belt, that allowed tropical diseases to come back. Like things that's the kind of poverty that you're looking at, and that's the kind of poverty that people are trying to flee. But like when you talk about, you mentioned the polling places, and like I said, you can have some benefit of the doubt on that. You can't have the benefit of the doubt like when, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the legislature passed a law that criminalized certain forms of absentee ballot voting assistance. When we talk about an aging population, absentee voting is kind of critical for those folks to have themselves heard. So even if you were to try to exclude, the racial elements of that, which I don't think you should, but even if you were to do that, you'd still see this law affecting a lot of the Black Belt counties because there's a lot of elderly people there, and there's a lot of poor folks who can't get around and can't get to the ballot box. So, sometimes there's a deliberate scheme going on here. Other times it's just people being ignorant of the challenges folks face, folks who aren't them.
Okay, so Kay Ivey This is her world. You gave the country Tommy Tuberville. I want to not thank you for that.
Understood.
But what do you love about the state?
I love the courage. I genuinely love the courage. The thing I think that people have to remember about Alabama is that its government does not reflect its people. What is inspiring about this state is how many people put themselves on the line over decades, over centuries, saying this is wrong, got to stop this. You talk about people down here feel a very profound connection to civil rights activists, the people. It was interesting a few years ago after John Lewis died, there was a movement to try to rename the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And a lot of Selma residents opposed that because they said, look, my father, my mother, my grandparents bled on that bridge.
With John Lewis.
Yeah, with John Lewis. They sacralized it, essentially. So we want to keep it. We want to keep it like that. And that feeling of sacrifice, of, martyrdom, the fact that Alabamians will face those overwhelming odds and say, this is wrong. And we will fight it as long as we have to, even if we don't see the victory. That really inspires me, and I think it should inspire the country. In the mid-'60s, it was that attitude that revolutionized the country and the world. And I don't think it's gone yet. And I'm looking forward, and I think this week's protest especially made me think that we are going to see a lot of pushback against what the legislature did this week.
And you think this, in the era you and I are in, the leadership for social action is coming from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. There aren't people raising their hand and leading these because they get killed. Mm-hmm. So is there the sustainable energy Alabama is largely responsible for the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
But that was 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You think that it still exists?
I think so, because that energy came out of the black churches in the state, and the black churches are still a very, very important driver of a lot of this stuff. It was preachers that we heard at the rallies. It's preachers who are still on the front lines of this activist movement, and it's the hymns and it's all that stuff. So there is that base there. When you look beyond that, there are certain areas of Alabama. Alabama is not going to become a purple state anytime soon. The demographics in the state simply just don't favor Democrats at the moment. But there are some areas where Democrats do have maybe some possibilities. I mentioned Huntsville earlier. Huntsville is a lot friendlier to Democrats than it used to be, and the party is really pushing up there this year. The college towns are like Lee County, home of Auburn, where I live. That's a lot less Republican than it used to be, and there are some long-term opportunities here. I think so. I wouldn't leave anybody with despair about this, because believe me, there are Alabamians out on the front lines fighting every single day, and who would absolutely agree with anybody listening here in Chicago that yes, this is terrible and we have to change it.
That is going to be the end, because we've run out of time. Brian, thanks so much. If people are interested in learning about the state, tell them how they can, find your work.
Yeah, I run a nonprofit website, part of State's Newsroom, called Alabama Reflector. We cover politics, policy, and everything else in the state. That's www.alabamareflector.com, and we are on Blue Sky and Facebook as well.
Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye. All right, everybody. The interview I promised you before is coming next. So stay tuned for that, and I'll be back later.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid, on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. It's my treat to be joined by Josh Orton, who's the president of Demand Justice, an organization fighting to protect the rule of law and to reform our courts. That is today, I want to say a losing battle, but one that we really, really need. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, I don't think my listeners need to be convinced that the Supreme Court has been captured by right-wing interests in America. Yet this week, John Roberts went on a tear whining that although he has destroyed the Voting Rights Act, given Trump legal immunity, validated Trump's election conspiracies by even taking this case on mail-in ballots, he objects to being called the partisan actor that he is. Now, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw that too. And what is so striking to me is how really condescending it was to the American people. The American people are not naive. The reason they think that the Supreme Court has been politicized and captured is because they're aware of what the Supreme Court has done and how they've conducted themselves. It just is facially untrue to say that the Supreme Court has not been acting politically. Just recently, you saw Clarence Thomas give an absolute screed against progressivism. Now, when you have, a progressive caucus in Congress, I call myself, progressivism is an ideology. It is a longstanding ideology in the United States. It is a political ideology. What in the world is a Supreme Court justice doing out giving a speech, railing against progressivism? If John Roberts doesn't want the court to be seen as political, then the justices in the majority on the Supreme Court have to stop acting like politicians. They have to stop ruling for Trump and the expansion of power for Trump and the Republican Party most of the time. They have to start, actually upholding the individual rights of people, and they have to stop, essentially achieving the wish list of giant corporations and the religious far right that they've had for generations, decision after decision after decision. And by the way, if they want to increase if they want to do something about the lack of trust in the Supreme Court, they should stop using the shadow docket, which is essentially what they've been doing to make rulings without any argument, without any justification, and without being signed. It is being abused. They will just say, we rule this way. We're not going to say who wrote it. We're not going to say what is behind it. This is the shadow docket, as it's called, was supposed to be used for procedural reasons. If John Roberts wants to stop being seen as a politician, if he wants the court to stop, being seen politically, and for the American people he wants to regain the trust of the American people, they have to start doing things vastly differently.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney. I read Supreme Court cases. I have since I've been an adult. I find them fascinating, and the dissents I think are largely written for Americans rather than, for the lawyers. It's just interesting. But the one thing I do understand, John Roberts can say, oh, you don't really understand constitutional law. This is a cult. That's why we wear robes. It's secret, right? It's oracle. But I understand political timing.
That's right.
And this court is playing politics with how long they sit on cases, what they take up when. There is not any reason to understand that, to protect that behind the secrecy of whatever constitutional law genius is. This is plain politics in its rawest form.
Well, I think, Edwin, you're onto something about this sort of the robes and everything. I think the other big problem that John Roberts has is he has an elitism problem. What they've done is essentially the reason that he tries to maintain this mythology that they're not political actors is by hiding behind what is essentially an elitist club of Supreme Court legal scholars and, behind Supreme Court jurisprudence, which I think I don't know. I don't mean to shock anybody when I say is kind of made up, right? A lot of the what the right has done so successfully is they've created institutions like the Federal Society, where they've found lawyers who are intellectually very smart and have a very high talent for the specific legal craft, but who are also essentially political mercenaries. And so the job of a far-right conservative federal judge for the last 30, 40 years or so has been someone who can, thinking about what they want as a political outcome, essentially backfill it philosophically and legally with Supreme Court jurisprudence to essentially mask the political intention. That is the job of a right-wing judge these days. And And honestly, the thing that I think is so absurd about John Roberts' statements is that people see through it. People understand. His problem is that people don't understand. His problem is that people do.
Yeah, I was going to get where you are in another 20 minutes, but I'll go there right now. I'll go there right now.
Let's cut to the chase, Edwin.
We'll do this in a different way. The most important job, well, let me ask this question first. If you had magic wand and they said, Josh, you can replace every judge in the federal judiciary today with a judge of your choice, you wouldn't pick left-leaning Alitos or Thomases for a single job, would you? Right. That's not what you're looking for, right? And this, when you go about being a judge in the way you described, a way that says, I have an outcome in mind and I am going to work the law to get it, you end up breaking the law. I mean, and I don't mean breaking a law, I mean breaking the law. You end up, I think the most important job of the Supreme Court is to make sure Americans know what the law is. Mm-hmm. Because, right, this function is complicated in America. It's enormously complicated, how the rule of law impacts society. And a court that acts the way these guys do leaves you not knowing. And so they've used the shadow docket in this way. And you have federal judges saying, I don't understand, I don't know how to do my job. All of the precedent says go this way. And you've issued a ruling with no explanation that says go the other way. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do my job, right? And it isn't just the shadow docket. The decision, Josh, on tariffs, mm-hmm. right, could have been a really easy decision. No, the executive branch doesn't have the power to tax. Mm-hmm. Instead, it was a lengthy, complicated set of decisions where they argued amongst themselves about what the law is. What is this major questions doctrine that we just made up?
That's right.
And they can't figure it out. So right. we are left in a nation that's supposed to be governed by the rule of law, where the Supreme Court, their most important job is to focus on the jurisprudence so we know what it is. And instead, they said, my job is the one you just described, right. which is my job is to bend jurisprudence to an outcome. And now we're left with a broken set of law.
Well, and I think that's a good point. And I would also, but I would challenge a little bit of what you said at the beginning, which is I would not choose a left-leaning Alito. However, I'm at the place where I'm not totally convinced that we have a system, that we have a Supreme Court, that we have a political system in which we have money flooding into our politics, and so Republican senators are forced to say that they will only confirm the most right-wing judges, right? Like a lot of how the Supreme Court got to where it is a product of how broken other parts of our democracy are. I'm not sure that there's. I don't know. I'll put it this way. I'm not sure how to return to a place, or even get to a place if it ever existed, where we have a Supreme Court where both parties agree to nominate people who are, in theory, just calling balls and strikes. Because I think this is part of the tension here, is that because the Constitution was written so many years ago, and because there's no way it could possibly, cover all of the different expansions of technology or social progress or the other thing, there's going to be interpretation. And so on some level, this idea that it is knowable what the Constitution says in some ways is a little bit of a myth itself, right? The idea of originalism. And so I think that what you're going to get is, you're always going to have judges or justices who come from different ideologies. And I think one of the criticisms of our own side might be, we have not yet recognized that this is not a meritocracy, that this is not just sort of some scientific or philosophical ivory tower, and we can just find the most skilled lawyers and put them there. This is a place where we actually need to nominate people who believe in what we believe in. And if I'm to sort of point to the apex of when I think this became a problem for us, it's sort of this weird historical event where, if you remember, Antonin Scalia died in the middle of a term, and Mitch McConnell almost immediately, as infamously, said, "Well, we're not going to confirm anybody before the midterm election. We want to see the results of what the people think, which is a ridiculous ahistorical political maneuver. And so you had this
knew when Amy Coney Barrett was up.
Yeah. Correct. And so, but there was this opportunity where, President Obama was going to nominate someone that essentially he knew would never be confirmed. And so it was this opportunity to essentially nominate someone for messaging purposes, right? It was like the first ever historical messaging nomination, right? This person was a lame duck from the beginning. And so the question became, what message do you want to send by who you nominate? It wasn't even a question of who do you want on the court, because we knew who he was going to nominate wasn't going to be on the court. The question was, who do you want to say should be on the court?
Okay. So this is really, I know where you're going. This is really interesting. So he nominated Merrick Garland.
And so so the question was, so did he nominate someone like Sonia Sotomayor or someone like Ketanji Jackson Brown, who would be, who clearly would send a message to the Democratic base, to the progressives, that we want someone who will uphold, our version, what we believe the Constitution to be, and that will be a progressive stalwart and a champion who might replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. No, he nominated someone to sort of try to project to the, Washington establishment that he was reasonable and the Republicans were unreasonable for blocking them. And let me tell you something, that message landed on no one. And so I think that while I agree that, it is in the ideal we should have people who just call balls and strikes, I'm not really sure that in our we're going to need people who, it's always going to be that the people that each party nominates are going to have an ideology. I think the question is, are they going to be intellectually honest about that ideology and about their views? And I think what the problem that this goes back to Roberts, I think the thing that really has created this problem for Roberts is that the right wing has for a very long time nominated people with an ideology and then lied through their teeth with a straight face that they don't have one, that they're just calling balls and strikes. I think it would be much better, frankly, if we were just more transparent about the fact that, we're going to nominate someone who believes in a progressive or believes in a conservative ideology. Like, if you want to nominate someone who is going to rule with corporations 99% of the time, just say that and see how we do.
Yeah, well,
it's a tough,
it scares me like it scared,
sure.
like it scared Hamilton. If you have a judiciary in the tank with one of the other branches, it's enormous.
I mean, here's the thing: is that this is not a hypothetical. We have, if you look at the rulings of this current Roberts court, they're overwhelmingly for concentrating power either with Wall Street and giant corporations, with the executive branch and Trump himself, or with the Republican Party. This is a court that is achieving the monopoly of power they are protecting power for the most powerful, and that's it.
Yep. Well, and we saw that in full display on those leaked memos at the dawn of the
absolutely
docket, where they said our credibility is at stake because we can't protect the oil company from being regulated. And they didn't say our credibility is at stake about the law. Oh my God, we might not be able to protect the oil companies from being regulated.
And by the way, even with the tariff decision, where they said, well, and frankly, Trump was humiliated by that decision because it was one of his signature. It was the embodiment of I'm a deal making president, and so that's my economic. The tariffs were how he made deals. That was inherent to him.
He's a mob president, and they were his.
That's right. Sure, exactly.
They were his leverage,
of course. But what I think was interesting is that I think people misread when the Supreme Court ruled. They misread the intention of the court. I don't think the court was ruling there against Trump. I think they were ruling in favor of the giant corporations who were going to be hurt by the tariffs. In that case, it wasn't that they didn't rule in favor of the powerful party. They actually ruled in favor of the other powerful party.
Right. Yeah. So I until recently, I thought, look, I'm sympathetic to the court because really important decisions that need to be made, Congress won't make. And they have to be made, and it falls on somebody to make them. Congress is broken. Now, leaving aside that John Roberts, that they broke Congress with Citizens United. Right, they broke it. So that's on them to begin with. But now I no longer believe that. Because when Congress has acted, as in McCain-Feingold, as in the Voting Rights Act, for God's sake, Congress did its job, and these people undid it. So I no longer, I gave them a lot of sway for saying, look, but we have an Article 1 problem, and that's what's messed up all of this and forced the judiciary to deal with questions they really shouldn't have to grapple with, but somebody must. Now I don't believe it. I believe that if Congress passed a law today that was clear about gerrymandering, that you can't do it, they would overturn it. They would just say, yeah, no. They are exercising imperial authority behind those robes in a way that is dangerous to a democracy.
Right. I think that's right. And in the case of McCain-Feingold, which was about regulating self-money, essentially the court re-argued it and said, well, we're going to make this about, they expanded the scope of the question. Normally the Supreme Court is supposed to minimize, in theory, make shrink the question that it's supposed to decide to the smallest one possible. Right, because the power to legislate should be with Congress.
Somebody else. Yeah.
But in the case of Citizens United, they actually expanded the question to achieve a result. So I think that's right. I think that but now I think we have an Article 1 challenge, because I think what we have is not just a far right court, but we they've essentially taken. The Roberts Court has essentially asserted judicial supremacy in these matters, and I think you're right. You think about the next Democratic president, and if they pass a progressive a slate of policies, it's going to run into the buzzsaw of this Roberts Court. And so it's going to be up, I think it's fair to say that any Democratic candidate for president in 2028, if they don't have as part of their policy platform a strategy to deal with the Roberts Court and the buzzsaw it exists now, then you can't take any of the other proposals seriously, because they're just going to go there to die.
They're going to, right? We had this problem in the 1760s, leading up to our revolution, when colonial congresses, legislators passed laws and the local governors annulled them.
Yep.
Right? It led to a revolution. Yep. And there is in this little document here, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but there is an exceptions clause that can be used to limit what this court gets to rule on. And I think the Article 1 powers should assert themselves with some aggression here to limit this court.
I agree. And this is why I think, Demand Justice, our organization, has long been in favor of Supreme Court expansion, in part because it's facially constitutional. The Supreme Court hasn't always had 9 justices. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, famously threatened to expand the court in, what they teach us in law school is called the switch in time that saved 9, right? Where he basically threatened to pack the Supreme Court and expand it if the court didn't essentially stop, overturning all of his policy.
And they did.
And they did, and I think I have a concern about the people calling for term limits for the Supreme Court, because I think that any policy to address the problems with the Supreme Court that gives them a way to strike it down, to me is not going to do it, and is not a serious proposal. And I agree with you on the Congress's assertion. I mean, I think there are serious conversations right now about Congress passing laws to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and other federal courts, because I think, again, it wasn't always the case, but I think this Supreme Court, this Roberts Court, has done everything they can to concentrate power with the powerful. And until we do something to break that up, it's just going to keep going. And frankly, I think it is in the court and our country's best interest, because I think that honestly, to me, expanding the Supreme Court and limiting its jurisdiction now is gonna in the long term would wind up being less radical than what would come if we don't do something now. To your point about our previous revolution, it would be less radical to expand the court now than to continue on this path and see what happens and see how the people rise up.
Yeah, I mean. It's been known by people who think about government forever that a partisan judiciary is a danger to any idea of freedom and democracy, and this is what we've got in ways that are really anti-democratic across the board. What they've unleashed across America now in terms of racial gerrymandering.
Yeah,
I mean, in my late 60s. Most of my life was like America becoming a real democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, Black Americans couldn't vote freely in presidential elections. The first one was 1968.
That's right.
And now across the South.
And I think that there's an argument that, we've really only been a fully realized democracy, to your point, for a much, Trump is going to, go headlong into this 250th anniversary of the country. Look, I would argue that we have not been a full democracy. I think it's a pretty simple case to make that we have not been a fully functioning, inclusive democracy for 250 years. I mean, it's impossible to say that we haven't, right?
It's an idea that's been unfolding.
It's been an idea, correct,
and a struggle to achieve it, and now it's in a struggle to keep it.
And I think about after the Dobbs decision, which overturned, Roe v. Wade and its, generations of precedent. Something that at the time then Vice President Harris said, which is that we're gonna, our kids now are going to be the first generation that is going to grow up with fewer rights than we did. And that was true when they overturned Dobbs. It's made more true now that they've, with this Calais decision, essentially gutting the last bastions of the Voting Rights Act. And I think, to go back to this, and I think that why it's so important to talk about this so plainly, and frankly in political terms, is because even you saw with the Calais decision that gutted the rest of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, rather. They tried to, the conservative majority in the court tried to argue, well, we didn't dismantle the Voting Rights Act. It's still there.
It's a lie.
We just right. And
it's
so
a lie.
Right. But that's the essence of the Roberts problem, is that they're lying to our faces about what they're doing, and then they're complaining when we notice. And I think that part of the challenge we face in reforms for our democracy, both after Trump in the executive branch and in the Supreme Court, is how do we get to a place where we have branches of government, and I think this is true with the Supreme Court, certainly, that even if we have people with ideology in one way or another, whether it's, let's say it's not partisan, it's going to be ideology. People just have different ideologies. That's part of the nature and the function of our democracy. It has to be transparently honest about who that ideology serves. And what I think has happened, and why the Supreme Court has, the nature of its secrecy, the nature of its sort of elite nature, has been that they've created this myth, this long-standing sort of story of a lie about how they've been calling balls and strikes, when the whole time they've been following an ideology of concentrated power. And I think people now understand that, and they're really mad. They're really mad about that. They're really mad about how that it's going to play out in congressional elections. But I think people look. I don't think this is going to become violent, and I would never say it should be. But I think what I think that the big mistake, and what is going to be Roberts' legacy here, is that when this problem of people's lack of faith in the Supreme Court and their belief in its partisan and political nature sort of reached this, maybe it's an apex, maybe they haven't reached the apex yet, reached the point that it is now, did he try and find ways to in a way that was not condescending, the way that was respectful to people and their views of democracy and how informed they are about what their government does, did he find a way to adjust, to change course? Did he basically double down on the myth? And right now he's doubling down on the myth. And that's not going to change until we change the structure of the court.
Yeah. Let me ask a question that is impossible for a lawyer to answer, and I apologize. But what if the next president showed up and said, the Supreme Court's illegitimate, and there are a pack of rulings that they have that are illegitimate, and they have to do with power in America. I am going to enforce the Voting Rights Act as it existed, period. We are going to, and my majority in Congress will not seat anyone elected from an illegal district. And I don't care what those robed oracles have to say about it. Because that's the logical, terrible outcome of what you have told me. This court is illegitimate. It is breaking our idea of law for a partisan purpose, and we have other branches of government that could behave the same way. So it's enormously dangerous, but I think we are very close to that.
So I think it's going to be incumbent on the next president, on a leader, to distinguish between the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court as a branch of government, as a constitutional branch of our government, and the Supreme Court as a currently sitting far-right majority. And so,
That's question, a very small needle to thread.
Well, that's the nature. That's the nature of our progress. I mean, because I think that what you're saying is calling the question of a constitutional crisis.
Well, we're in one. I think we're in one. I think they caused it.
I agree. But I think the question is, as we know in our democracy, it is only true if we're able to communicate it well. And I think the danger, I think, with that, and it's something that I think we'd have to think about more specifically. I think doing that on a global, doing this across 5 different decisions, saying none of these were legit, and so I'm going to pretend they never happened. I think doing that doing that with such breadth, I think, would be a hard sell, because it would look like the president was actually questioning the credibility of the Supreme Court as an institution. Now, if a new president was proposing some fairly radical reforms to the Supreme Court, including expansion, that at the same time sort of inherently acknowledges the credibility of the court itself, but that it just needs to be restored, right? That the fundamental concept of the court is legit. And then perhaps, and I have to think through the likelihood of that, I'm just sort of thinking both as a lawyer and a political operative, and then perhaps chose one decision that was so egregiously illegitimate and then selectively did not follow. That would, I can see that as a more saleable case. That we're now just playing parlor games here, but I do think that
moving this so-called Overton window.
Well, right, but I do think fundamentally, looking at looking at what a next Democratic president is going to have to face, it is like they're going to have to propose things that will actually train. This is no longer just about the switch in time that saved 9, because where Roosevelt felt that he could actually affect the conduct of the court with a threat. Mm-hmm. I think we're past that. I just don't. I think that a president is actually, and a Congress is actually going to have to change the dynamic of a court. And by the way, I would be fairly excited to vote for, if to vote in a presidential election, if I thought it meant that President Ocasio-Cortez was going to be able to appoint, 6 new justices. But I think that in the short term, though, we have a even more acute problem, which is that I believe that Donald Trump is going to get 2 Supreme Court vacancies this year, because I think the apex of his power to nominate and confirm them is between now and the midterm. And we're doing this now at a time where not a single one of his judicial nominees to lifetime seats at any level of the federal court will even admit he lost the 2020 election or that January 6th was an attack on the Capitol. I mean, we've got a real problem. And by the way, 19 Senate Democrats have voted for at least one of these judges.
I can't get over it. I can't. I have nothing good to say about the old habit that old members of my party are in of let's make a deal. You cannot make a good deal with a bad partner. And this is where we are.
That's right.
They can't do it. And so they have, I mean, you see the damage that someone like Eileen Cannon has done. Why would you want to repeat that?
Well, and you think through too, like, I can see, I can sort of think like if I sort of force myself to, I can sort of think like one of these senators and saying, well, hedging on the 2020 election and saying, well, technically, giving one of these evasive, weird answers, they'll all say that, well, technically Joe Biden was certified the winner. It's like they can't actually say that he was a winner.
Yeah. Josh, I got to interrupt you because we are almost out of time.
Okay.
So let's use the minute we have left for you to tell people how to follow your work to make a difference.
Yeah, you can follow us online at We Demand Justice and go to our website, demandjustice.org. Look, what we're doing right now is we're preparing for 1 or 2 Supreme Court vacancies this calendar year before the midterm from Donald Trump. We have to be ready. We have to be ready to fight back. And we have to be ready to hold Democrats accountable if they're unwilling to fight these nominations. It is essential. Trump is attacking our democracy, and we have to be ready to fight.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks. Let's do it again.
Yep.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. I am joined by Lisa Corrigan, who is a professor of communications at the University of Arkansas. As she and I were talking earlier, I tried to explain her work in my own words, and I thought, it's so interesting because it, for me at least, talks about how the way we talk about the world creates the opportunity, at least, for political power, particularly among marginalized communities. And then as we came on the air, I was asking if I had it right. So I don't know. Does that sound right?
It sounds right. Yeah, I'm really interested in the way that we talk about politics itself and about how that ends up shaping the world for us. And the people who control the way we talk about it actually control the politics. So I think for a lot of folks, especially if they're not involved in politics in a regular way, there is this sense of myth about it. And that myth is intentionally designed, right, to draw them in or repel them.
To draw them in and repel them?
Yeah, I mean, not the same people, right? But the myths will either draw some people in and repel others, and that's the way that we create political identities.
That's so interesting. And so the opportunity for agency at the moment, if that insight is true, is really interesting. So right? So,
oh, yeah. This is the biggest moment of potential interest convergence to reshape political identity, probably since the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old. I lived through much of the 1960s as a young man. There was a lot going on then too. But yes.
I mean, the identities weren't shifting in the same ways. White liberals stayed pretty static and got more conservative, even certainly by, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And so it's sort of been a slippery slope since then. But in terms of like the massive amount of capital moving and the way that that is shaping political identity, the 60s had nothing.
Nothing like that. So talk about what the convergence is that you think you see.
Well, there's so many pieces, but we're talking about, cash right now. Finance capital is moving. It's reshaping the communication infrastructure of the culture. And I would say that that's a huge difference from the 1960s.
Yes.
But one that's similar to the 1860s. So that is changing how we talk about politics and who we're speaking to. So the consolidation of media empires, like the mass firings of journalists, this, right? The number of outlets that we have available to read and think about ourselves and others is shrinking precipitously and is becoming fragmented in a way that's really problematic. So I would say certainly the mass communication side is really different.
Well, let's stay with that for a second.
Sure.
It's not where I thought our conversation was going at all, but for a while I ran a big Chicago newspaper.
Yes, you did.
And it's a terrible business. I think the numbers of outlets, local news has been destroyed all over the country. But then there's things like this. There's this mass proliferation of other kinds of media now, which is like in the 1860s and the 1910s, like New York had 70 newspapers or something, right? So people said, which one do I trust? Which one do I trust? And in some ways, the mass media that I grew up with, which told us what to believe, he told us what was true, there was something lovely about it, but so many people's stories never got told. Not at all, like they didn't exist, and that's problematic too. So I'm not sure the fragmentation of media bothers me so much. The lesson we're learning on how to deal with the lies in media, that is a big challenge.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I'm sympathetic to it, except that everybody can find a conspiracy theorist and then just mainline it.
Right.
And so I actually think that that's super problematic, and a bunch of the identity problems that we're facing come from that, which is definitely a side effect of media fragmentation. And I also think that the way that the media is unfolding in terms of its, temporality, right? Like how fast we're getting news, how short the bits are, how decontextualized they are, the death of long form journalism. Those are also side effects of, right, what you're describing, and they're bad. Yeah. They're bad because it removes the critical thinking function that you were pointing out was so essential in those earlier moments of interest convergence that we were talking about. And so I actually think that it's a problem, right, that there are so many voices. It's like the Tower of Babel, right? Mm-hmm. So people don't know where to turn. They don't know how to verify their sources. They don't know how to identify strong claims. They don't know how to vet evidence, right? They don't have a sense about how to consume the media in responsible ways and or share it. And that seems seems like a problem. Now, on the other hand, there are stories that are being told that have never been told before, but the question is who's able to access those, and that's a question of capital, right? So as we see in further and further stratification of the media environment, those stories are going to be pushed to the margins even further. So there's opportunity, and there's also a series of major barriers that I think create a different landscape than we've ever seen.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So stories are told. I mean, Walter Cronkite, God bless him, said that's the way it is every night. But in his America, the way he told that story, no one was gay. Not anyone. Like, didn't exist.
Absolutely.
Right? Didn't like, okay, that like we discovered that later. Like, okay, yeah, sure, Walter. So now these stories all get told, but as you point, when you say it's about capital, the way I think about that, and it's the way I think about Citizens United, is that I am free to say whatever I want. But if you have enough money, you are free to set up 2 enormous speakers and amplifiers around me and say what you want so loud that although I'm free to say what I want, no one can hear me.
I mean, and the money to sue everybody who tells, the culture that you're a liar, right? Mm-hmm. So like, it's not just the amplification and circulation, it's
suppression as well.
Absolutely, 100%. So I think that disincentivizes the telling the stories that I suspect you and I are most interested in hearing. And I joked the other day, like, I want to read all of your Substacks. I want them in one place. It's called a newspaper.
Yeah, right.
Like, there's only so much of the reinventing of the wheel that can be done when there's an efficiency to something like a newspaper that can deliver multiple viewpoints at the same time on similar topics that you can read daily. And the dailies, the loss of the dailies is a problem. So for me, in thinking about what a political identity is, to have no through line is just chaos. And I think that that's what a lot of Americans, especially the ones that are not, living and breathing politics like I do, that's what they're feeling. It's like, where do I turn to? Who do I trust? What do I read? What is real? I mean, this is a post-truth crisis.
I have very good friends who are really smart, who don't follow this stuff as closely as I do, and they tell me stuff that is crazy.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I have people who are not crazy, who say occasional crazy things that become a part of their worldview and in really problematic ways. And that is now basically the presidential administration, right? All those people got institutionalized. And so now they have control over the policy rigs. And that is an identity crisis in a different direction, but perhaps more devastating.
You wrote this book, Prison Power. And one of its arguments, I think, is that mass incarceration in America grew more out of racial animus than a rational response to crime.
Absolutely.
Right? And now we're seeing an administration build concentration camps and use both rhetoric and the power of government, I think, to create new and renewed race and gender-based animosities. What could go wrong?
Well, I mean, a lot of things, especially when that government also is entirely predicated on mafia capitalism. I mean, all they're doing is criming. So it's not just that their articulation of crime as a political problem was suspect, right, as an argument, and was also obviously racist. It's that they are criming for personal enrichment, and that is driving all of the policy calculations that are affecting the lives of billions of people on Earth. I mean, the scale and scope of the criminal enterprise of the moment dwarfs anything that I write about in the 1960s and early 70s.
Yeah, I think this is what's actually going to get them. I mean, I was a Chicago alderman, and, my colleagues went to jail at a great clip. By the way, the Chicago City Council is held in higher esteem now than the Supreme Court. But
bar's low.
but people were legitimately angry if somebody took $1,500 to fix where a stop sign goes. They were angry about it, and $1,500, these guys wouldn't bend over and pick it up.
Yeah. I think that's what'll get them too. I mean, it's really hard not to see like a giant slew when the pendulum swings of like RICO violations to just sweep them up, because that's really how the 80s went down. And so I think that's without a doubt the way that the narrative will go. I think that's how the realignment will go. I think that's how the, criminal trials will go. I think it will become racketeering actually and organized crime. If I had to guess right now.
Yes, yeah. All right. Well, this book, Prison Power, had another argument, I think, and that was that the experience of mass incarceration also led to a powerful liberation movement. So at the moment, we talk about what could go wrong. What could go right? What
I
could
mean,
go right?
I think that a canary in the coal mine in the moment is the wine moms. I think that the white ladies showing up at the Home Depot to scream at ICE and to get online and raise funds to support families who've been ripped apart by this inhumane regime. That is a canary in the coal. There were no white women in the civil rights movement showing up en masse to do that kind of public intervention on behalf of people of color, whom they did not know personally. Not a thing. That's an absolutely new feature of American life. It is a convergence of values that did not exist in the 60s or 70s at all. And it is reshaping the suburbs and the cities in ways that are going to have huge consequences downstream. So I think that mass incarceration has the opportunity to rebuild because it is so horrifying and the conditions have gotten so much worse. And these concentrations are so heinous and there are so many children involved, which was not a feature of mass incarceration in the 60s in the same way. For a whole host of reasons, including the fact that many of the children that were enemies of the state were lynched or assassinated. So, I think that this moment is such an escalation of tactics in scope and kind that it's going to be impossible to tear it out of the memory, of the political memory of this moment. It's going to be so central in shaping how we think and talk about the administration and its crimes.
That could be positive. I went to a campaign event to hear people running for Congress here, and ICE was here.
Yes, they were.
Yeah,
They still are.
They are again. And the way Chicago dealt with the first ICE attack, I made me very proud of my city, very proud. And it was people who are not political came out and walked other people's kids to school or took them trick or treating. And I mean, just what we did to protect each other. That's not fair. I know we like to say everybody did it to protect each other, and that's part of it for sure. But also, we Americans do not like armed thugs pushing us around.
Absolutely.
Period. And so there was a lot of reaction just to that. But when I listened to, I asked the people in the room before the candidates got there, what should the next congressperson do? Well, if a Democrat wins, what's top of your list? And it was all about like, don't ever let ICE do this again, right? If Democrats win, there isn't going to be ICE doing that again. They have to think about like, how do we balance constitutional powers in a different way, not to have this, right? But they couldn't get past the trauma of armed thugs on their streets to think about these other questions. Is this convergence and this memory you're talking about going to limit our aspirations?
I think political parties limit aspirations. I think the Democratic Party has limited the horizons under which it's willing to operate and or expand its vision of America. And that has been constrained by finance capital, right? Like if you let, the internet bros finance your campaigns, the amount of surveillance tech that you're going to allow in your cities, states, and countries is going to expand significantly. And the Democrats have done that. So I don't know that the parties are a way to think about what the future looks like since they're both so deeply embedded in the military industrial complex.
Well, they're changing. I think they're changing. There's this new generation saying the party as it exists in Washington is not what it is. Not the people I stood with in No Kings.
That's good. And I'm glad I'm in the South. So
I want to get to the South. You're also from Ohio. So I want to get to both of those case studies with you in a second.
Yes, both different from where you're at.
Yeah.
Special location. But yeah, I think that the bigger thing is a time horizon. So I think in the short term, white people who don't have a very large risk threshold felt overwhelmed and, horrified and demobilized in particular ways, but other people took up the mantle. It's not like Portland didn't do the same thing, right? It's not like Minneapolis didn't.
Minneapolis took the lessons we brought to them and did better.
Jersey. Yeah. So that it's not like all of the social change happens in one social location at once and then the whole system transforms. It's more like, wildfires that get spread by the winds, right? That's more like what the social movement ecology looks like right now. And I say that to deliberately also invoke climate change, which is going to definitely influence the way that we protest in the future. And that's a sidebar, but an important one. So yeah, I think that you're right, that I'm sure that you ran into people who were like, we're going to do a different thing. And I hope that that's true. But
the question is, the time we're in, can organized people beat organized money? And that, I mean, that your complaint is about
Yes.
the way capital has influenced our politics, um, and probably has. I would extend it to your view. Probably have a view of the economy, and it's the right. I mean, society more largely than politics. I know we're in a moment where we think politics is everything, but it's not. Right. So, but I think your critique is bigger than politics. The question is, can organized people this time, because the coalition is so big and diverse, make a dent in organized money?
Yes, but it comes in a lot of flavors. So
Yep.
I'll tell you what it also comes in. It comes in Luigi Mangioni's. I write about John Brown. And there is no Civil War in America without John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist prior to him. He didn't exist in American life prior to the raid on Harper's Ferry. It was a singular defining event that changed the entire course of the Republican Party, its nomination structure, Fort Sumter, congressional debates about what abolition was and should or shouldn't.
Boy, I have to think about that for a long time.
You can. I've been writing about it for 5 years. You can think about it as long as you like. I feel completely certain about
it's really, and that's really interesting.
His speech at his execution,
yeah,
was without a doubt the most important 200 words in American history, and it changed the way that white people on both sides thought about what resistance looked like. And we didn't need 10,000 John Browns, and we didn't need 10,000 slave revolts. We needed one dude to do the thing, to reframe it for an entire generation of people. And so I'm just saying that resistance comes in lots of different flavors, and it happens in ways that are unpredictable and that can only be made sense of after the fact. And we are in year one of what might be the next U.S. Civil War, and also we're going to need a reconstruction. And so the horizon timeline for that is not immediate, like the internet, right? This is going to unfold over 10 years or more. And it's going to look very different in different times and places, right? As we map it, from the future backwards. So I just think that people need to be aware of the kinds of resources, like storytelling resources, that are available to talk to folks who are concerned but don't have a vocabulary for what they think that they're seeing. And that's in the everyday life. That's as important as info politics. It's happening at the coffee shops, it's happening in the library, it's happening at the bookstore, it's happening, in the factory, it's happening on the fields, it's happening in community. And that was something that was very strong in the 1860s. It's certainly the case in the 1960s. And it's also the case now as people are trying to reconnect because of their disenfranchisement and alienation because of the internet. So I think the resistance comes in a lot of forms and fashions.
What do you think of the No Kings phenomena?
I think that personally, I feel ambivalent about parts of it. Like in the 1960s, you had leaders, right? And they were mostly assassinated or driven underground. And so we're not going to have a leadership structure, right, for social movement organizing today like we did then, because people learn that lesson. If you're the leader, you're going to get shot. Right. So it's not going to look like that. It's going to look like this centralized and then decentralized back and forth between people who have the megaphone and the organizational capacity to host giant Zooms where they fundraise and connect and build capacity. And it's going to be local groups who are doing the daily work of connecting with the people. So I think it's not a structure that's going to be easily displaced and will be fundamental. And also, it's a huge tent, so there are lots of different kinds of people under it, and they don't necessarily agree. And that's like the promise of liberalism, right?
Well, like I went to some of the rallies, and they have speakers.
Yes.
Many of them, and a lot of the people don't like what the speakers have to say.
Sure.
But they're there anyway.
Yes, that's also how voting works. Right? I vote for people I don't agree with lots of I'm sure you have voted for people you didn't agree with 100% of the time. That's how like a plurality of ideas works. That's like the nature of the social bargain that we made if we're trying to pursue this myth of the, liberal society. So that's the cost of doing business. And so for me, that's why I think that No Kings is essential, and you can have feelings about different versions of it or people who lead it or people who are at your rally. And at the end of the day, that's not really the point. The point is that people continue wanting to get together that way and do mass protests in that form. And the continuity of that is really important as a touchstone, that people are marking themselves as dissatisfied. They are gathering together. They are asserting their First Amendment at a time when the First Amendment is absolutely being dismantled. Like those are really important functions of the movement as No Kings has built it.
I think a lot about narrative. I mean, I will not be in the business I'm in detached from facts. I won't go that far. I just won't do it. But I think a lot about how to organize the facts in front of me in a way that carries a message that helps people understand the peril of this moment and the promise of this moment. And I also teach at a local university on challenges to American democracy. And you know this because you teach all the time. The kids, when they come in and are confronted with this topic, can barely get their heads off the table because it's so depressing. And I'm like, why are you upset? You live in a time that matters. What you do matters. How can we, what are the narrative arguments that you have found that resonate with another generation who sees they have fewer rights than their parents and grandparents, and yet tells them they have more promise?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that they don't live the same kind of youth that I suspect you and I had, right? So
I know they don't. Much tougher.
They don't. Yeah, in a lot of ways. They're surveilled all the time. They have helicopter parents. They have all these expectations about career and capital and family and religion. And it just was not the same kind of experience, especially in college for me or you, I suspect. So I think to have
also,
empathy.
they lack the time to reflect because everything is on this phone.
Well, and their literacy skills are garbage. And I say that doing literacy work every single day. They come in wildly unprepared. They're so much less prepared than you or I were, I'm sure. And I had a great public education in Ohio, which I did not know at the time. But certainly as I matriculated through graduate school and got my PhD and came to teach, it's a totally different thing. So, I think having empathy for them is really important. In terms of arguments, I don't know that you have to make arguments. I think this is a very dense, affective, emotional field. And so even though I'm a debater and I love to make arguments and I do that for a living, teaching is more about connecting with them. And I think it's really important to hold their fear. They know that the economy is an illusion, and they know that their life expectancy is less than their parents. They know that their financial expectancy is less than their parents. They know they're less likely to buy a house before they're 40 years old. Every metric of quote unquote success and the American dream and quote unquote normal is not available to them. And so that's desperation. And so to teach them that they are not coming to college to get the perfect skills, to get the perfect job, that's not ever been the case of public education and higher ed. And it's definitely not going to be the case in the future. They're going to have to be nimble and thoughtful and have critical thinking skills.
Oh my God. You mean we need to start to value a liberal arts again?
Yes, all of them. But also science. The scientists, bless their hearts, they're like, oh, nobody's going to touch us. We are untouchable and very important. It's
yeah, not true.
How are those NSF grants working for you? Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. They're gone. So, it's not just the liberal arts, although obviously, I'm partial to them. It's also science. And so I think to help them find their path is to be like, how is this speaking to you and how can you connect with other people in whatever facet it is? I think that that's always been, an important part of public education's mission. And I think we can still do it even in this, dreadful climate that we're living through. But to empower them to feel like they can make a difference, that's, I think, the uphill battle, right? To connect.
Well, I wasn't just talking about my students. I do a lot of media. The audience of this show is a lot older than my students.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, they're different though. That's a totally different population to talk to because they're like, why are the young people so lazy and why are they this way and why are they that way? And it's like, it's a totally different world that they're living in. Every single feature of American life has shifted so thoroughly that you are not sharing the same reality as young people who are coming through now, whether they're going to college or not. We're not sharing the same reality. There's no expectation of the youngs that they're sharing the reality with Gen Xers or boomers at all. They're not. They're simply not. Everything about the way that they see their life is so radically different. So that generational difference is probably closer to the greatest generation and their parents, actually. In terms of the distance between the way that they see their lives in the futures. And so closing that gap is about bringing intergenerational communities together, which is what No Kings does. So, people are like, oh, well, there are a lot of old white people at No Kings. Well, great. Who do you think is blowing up the Tesla stations? Who do you think is out wrecking Elon Musk while he's dojing? It's Definitely the boomers. So I'm like, that is also not a feature of the civil rights era to have white boomers out protesting like anything really.
Mhm.
So it's really important, right, that older people who are white are participating in taking up public space in a way that increases the threshold that they have for social risk. And I love to see it. So for them, I think No Kings is doing really important intergenerational work of connecting the young people and the older people in the space of protest to try and reimagine what a better future looks like. And that includes perspectives from the past, even if they're flawed.
Okay, so I've gotten a sense of you from our conversation, from when I've read about your books. How is it where you live? How do you make your way through today's South, where where civil rights seems to be a distant memory?
Yeah, I mean, Arkansas is different because it's more plains. Where I live, I'm up in the northwest corner, and so it's more like the plains than it is the deep south, but it's controlled by people who are doing lost cause ideology really hard, in the same way that we talked about what's the matter with Kansas, right?
A book that I hate.
Yeah, it's
And I thought it was patronizing and caused enormous problems.
Yes, but the answer is the Koch brothers, and that is also the problem here is that they came and fought at our legislature, and we went from a blue dog Democrat state to this monstrosity with all of its corruptions and ideologies. And so, what is it like here? I have to tell you, I have never met so many people. I've been involved in politics here for almost 20 years. I've worked in politics for 35. I started at 15 in Ohio, and I have never seen more people engaged here in the political process. And I don't mean formal politics. I don't necessarily mean like League of Women Voters and voting. I mean in every kind of assessment of political work, as generous as you could make it.
Well, go back to what you began, creating a narrative that creates the opportunity for power to change.
Yes. And so there are more people invested in the outcome here. There are more people who are interested in process. There are more people who are willing to join organizations. Like it's less bowling alone here than it was when I moved here, right, in the early 2000s. And so I feel like it won't take much to tip Arkansas back socially, but that's not really how power works, right? So
It's a start. You don't get the one without the other, but yeah, it's
correct. Yes, but there still is a superstructure that is controlling the way that formal politics unfolds here that is problematic. But I will say that even then, like we were the first to expand the Affordable Care Act. We built the private option. I was part of that. It was wild. It was heady. It was very fun. There was a lot of karaoke. And the young Gen X Republicans who led that, if they didn't go to jail for like insider trading, were very charismatic and thoughtful and provocative about the importance of public goods. And so I think whether it's in Arkansas or elsewhere around the South, a return to the public and the public good is a really important way of understanding what benefits that everybody's about to lose if they haven't lost them already, whether that's voting through Jim Crowification, right, of the South. I'm thinking about Tennessee today, obviously, or whether it's healthcare and the cost of healthcare, or whether it's public education through vouchers. People are going to need to be able to find outlets to describe what they've lost, which is going to be so much. And so to think about that now in terms of public goods, I think is the way to go.
That's got to be our last word because we've run very quickly through a half hour. I really appreciate it. I mean, if somebody wants to follow your work or, learn more about you, what do they do?
They can follow me on Blue Sky at Dr. Lisa Corrigan.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, lovely to see you, Edwin.
And you.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
773-763-9278. I want to hear from you. And Jim, kick us off.
Hi, Edwin. Your whole broadcast, it reminds me of my misspent youth. I had a cousin who had a dear friend in the Irish Fellowship Club, a judge at the Daily Center. And I needed a reference for something. So he said, let's go up and see him. We'll go out for a few drinks. So we go up there, and the judge brings us into his office, and he's got paperwork piled to the ceiling. He's got paperwork in these boxes all over the place. He says, can you believe I spent 6 months on a divorce case where they're suing each other for the dog's leash, the vanity plate. He goes, "This is justice. This is justice in America." But he did say, but at the end, after we had a few drinks, he said, "Listen, kid, because whatever you do, stay off the front page." And I took that literally, and that's over 50 years ago. But think about this deal. You're going to have two teenagers on the Supreme Court after Alito and the other guy quits. And they'll probably have a correspondence course. So we'll have republicanism for generations. And they figured it out that the way to go about, forget the ballot box. You don't need the ballot box anymore. All you need are the courts. And they captured the courts. Sheldon Whitehouse had the price sticker on every judge that was up that year, the last Supreme Court nomination deal. He got like $800,000, $2 million, $3 million. He had a regular. You were in a car lot. So my point is that we're in for a world of hurt. That's all I got to say. I mean, the ballot box is immaterial now. It was the courts. And Leonard Leo and the boys figured it out, but there's a lot of serendipity there, Edwin. I mean, because what were the odds? I didn't think Clinton was going to lose. Did you? I didn't think she was going to lose. But I mean, it just shows you how history depends on just serendipity itself. Just how one turn of the wheel of the cart, and you've got generations in a world of hurt. That's the weird thing about it. You know, and take World War I, for instance. That chauffeur with the Archduke took the right. He got the wrong direction. So he actually pulled up in front of the assassin. The assassin had given up, and he pulled up in front of the place and shot him. You saw the result of that, and you go on and on with it throughout history. But we're in a world of hurt here, Edwin. I don't know what you suggest, but
I agree with almost all of that. The one thing where you've gone further than I'm willing to go is the ballot box doesn't matter. Yes, it isn't fair. Yes, they have rigged it. Yes, we don't have completely free and fair elections. They didn't have them in Hungary either. But the ballot box still matters. And if we show up in big enough numbers, we will actually begin to turn this around and start to deal with all this hurt. But otherwise, I completely agree with you, Jim.
Yeah, no, but Edwin, I agree. But the point is, the Supreme Court is so much against the voter.
I agree with you.
I don't know what this is going to do to the voter. I don't know. You know, I mean, I thought the midterms were a cinch. I thought they were a cinch, and I thought Hillary Clinton was a cinch. So
some of that was some of that was Bernie's supporters refusing to go vote.
Right.
So this time we have to just put our entire coalition together, and we know better than we did back then.
Yeah, I agree with you. I got my fingers crossed and praying we got to get the hugest turnout in history. Thank you, Edwin. Thanks for taking my call. Thank you.
You bet, Jim. Thank you. All right, Dave, other than the Cubs' fabulous winning streak, what's on your mind?
I read an interesting article today about where use of JAG officers to prosecute civilians flouts Pentagon's own rules, the judge says. The federal government's use of an active duty Army lawyer to prosecute a civilian in Minnesota runs afoul of military regulations, U.S. Magistrate Shannon Elkin said yesterday. Department of Defense regulations recognize that having military lawyers prosecute civilians in cases that lack a military nexus would be ill-advised, Elkins wrote. But she said these regulations do not authorize this court to strike the appearance of a military attorney that the Department of Justice appointed. Former JAG officers said the practice also appears to contravene Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's instructions to military officials to refocus the JAG course on advising commanders in the fight on operations, rather than civilian legal matters. A group of 11 former JAG officers are filing an amicus brief arguing that the use of military lawyers to prosecute civilians in cases with no military issue violates the Posse Comitatus Act and Pentagon policy, and that the Posse Comitatus Act forbids the military from enforcing civilian lawyers or laws and operating as law enforcement domestically. And besides this case, it was in Minnesota where the a gentleman had sprayed one of those those guys in the face, the ICE guys or whatever.
Yeah.
But it said also where dozens of JAG officers have been sent in recent months to help prosecute cases in Memphis, Tennessee, Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis as part of the Trump administration's immigration crackdown.
Well, Dave, I know about a couple of these, and you're right to bring it up. It's enormously worrying. First, Hegseth does not want the JAG officers doing their job, which is to advise the military on the limits, the legal limits of what they can do. He does not want that. So he's already fired leaders of the JAG team, so he doesn't have to hear about the legal limits on what they can do. But the militarization of everything in America, whether it's the ICE thugs on our streets or the JAG officers in our courts, it is all the kind of things you get from a government that is solely coercive and uses military force against its own people. It is not, strictly speaking, illegal, but in every way it's wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought it up.
Hey, Edwin, real quick before you get there, I was watching this morning on the CNN first that Table for Five, with Abby, and then the other one with Smerconish, and they were each talking about that Mayor Mamdani in New York. He was doing about the tax thing and that, but the fact that where he was standing outside that building of Ken Griffin's, that one, and he don't live there, that's like his next whatever, if he's in town type of thing, but it's an exorbitant price. But they're saying it's putting him in danger and stuff like that. But yet, and I didn't see Smerconish or that Abby and them talk about the fact that this Chris Pratt, this washed up celebrity guy who's running for L.A. mayor, they had a picture of him standing in front of Karen Bass's home. Isn't this a kind of a threat to her safety, too? And why the double standard?
They didn't care when the Speaker of the Minnesota House was murdered by a right-wing assailant. They didn't care. They didn't say anything. They do not care.
Right.
I'm sorry. When Charlie Kirk was shot and before he died, I wrote something praying for his, survival, because I don't believe in political violence. And that does not mean I agree with Charlie Kirk on anything. I think political violence is terrible. And I think it's important that we say it. And it's important we say it when people we don't like are its victims. And so I did. These guys will never say it. They've sanctioned political violence. They pardoned violent actors in our politics. This is one of the dangers we're living with right now, Dave. Thank you for bringing that up.
All right.
Yep.
Be well, Edwin.
You too. All right, Paul.
Well, it's clear, Edwin, that the power of the courts must be limited because, I hope you read what I sent you earlier. The courts have become what they should never be, and that is that they have politicized themselves and thus become, I suppose, the preferred tool of the politics now. I don't see. I think and let me just tell other people what I wrote to you. There are seven amendments in the Constitution that pertain to voting, and all of them have the words at the end: Congress shall have the power to enforce this article with appropriate legislation. That doesn't just mean that Congress has the power to enact legislation. That would be stupid to think that that's what it means. What that really means, in my view, is that that's a signal to the courts that that's hands off. That there's no judicial review on that. That says, because it says Congress shall have the power. That's adding a power of Congress to the powers, the enumerated powers that exist already in the Constitution in Article 8. And when Congress enacts a law or passes a law, the executive has to sign it into law. Once that's done, the two proactive branches of government have acted, and that's a further sign to the courts: take your damn hands off. This is not for you. And I'm sorry that when I suggest this to other legal experts, a lot of them are good. Some of them, you get this. I'm sorry, I call it splaining. I get this splaining about Marbury versus Madison. I know all about Marbury versus Madison, okay? I do. And frankly, it's not all encompassing. It doesn't mean that all the branches don't have any power. So what the courts have done, the Supreme Court has said that the politicians, again, can have carte blanche to choose their voters. And not the other way around. The voters are supposed to choose who the representatives that they want in government. And all voters, all citizens who have the right to vote, have a right to a meaningful choice in who they elect. And I think the situation in Virginia, the 4 judges on the Virginia Supreme Court, they just, as I said, they apparently can't find a bright line rule that says what an election is. So they say, an election, the rules are complicated. Maybe people don't understand it, but an election takes place on election day. But they decided, well, no, election takes place, during pre-voting. Well, then, hell, why don't you just say, well, when the ballots are mailed out or when people start campaigning? We're always an election. It's just, if you can't find that bright line rule, then you don't go searching around for some way to rule in a way that suits you. It's just. I think, as I said before, the idea in the days of our founding that judges will have great credibility and when they have lifetime appointments they will be even more is BS, because in those days they didn't understand modern psychology, which we now know is that kind of great self. What am I trying to say? The integrity. It doesn't exist, and the justices on this Supreme Court have so much of said so. Was it last year in the Wall Street Journal, an interview with Samuel Alito? He said, "I'm a monarch in my own domain. I can do whatever I want."
Yeah.
And he just says this out loud. He said they're not trying to hide it anymore.
Well, Americans see what they're not hiding, and we don't like it. And even though they've tilted the playing field, even though they are doing everything they can to make our votes not count, we have to show up. And even before then, we have to continue to call it out as you are. I dedicated nearly 3 hours today to the rampant what do we call it? Restoration of racist political structures across the South and in other places. This is really happening. And you and I knew it would happen. We told everybody it would happen. America wasn't ready to hear it, but I don't think America's ready to accept it. So now that it's happening, we come late to the game, but once we're in the game, we're there to win. And you heard from all of these people I was talking to today, whether they were in Alabama or Tennessee, that more and more people are showing up saying this cannot be. Now, they could have stopped it before it happened if they'd been awake. But okay, now they see it like, nope, we are not going to let it happen. And
winning the game. I will suggest this that Trump has kind of demonstrated, and I ran this by William Muck, that he said, well, it's hard to know what the rules are. And I said, well, then let's not be the ones. The Democrats are always the one who kind of pre-consciously say, well, you can't do that. You can't do that. Democrats always say that, well, you can't do that. Well, we haven't done that in the past, but we don't always have to play by Queensberry rules. I
agree with you. And that's why I think the next president should consider saying the Supreme Court is legitimate institution. Those who sit on it today have abused its legitimacy for illegitimate purposes, and therefore I will start enforcing the Voting Rights Act with the full force of the federal government the day I arrive, period. And I don't care what the Supreme Court says.
That's great. Just start doing it, because that's what Trump does. Here's another thing I would do.
Oh, I don't want to do it
Because
because it's what
clear.
Trump does. I actually think it's a terrible thing and a grave danger,
Well, maybe-
but it is because we have a constitutional crisis that these people have thrown us into.
But I'm saying not because Trump does that, because Trump has expanded the idea of what the rules are. And the
Yeah.
courts are going along to, well, maybe the courts have taken to this, well, we can't stop him, so I guess he can. I mean,
Yeah, well, the courts are plenty. This court is plenty eager to stop, say Joe Biden. So I don't want to.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, so it's
brings
time to
up the-
reform the court.
the-
Absolutely, it's a danger. Hey,
You
Paul,
can't-
I got a
Andrew,
couple
with
other
race-
people. I'm gonna.
Okay.
I'm gonna. Thank you, Roosevelt. You've been patient.
Double E, thank
Welcome
you for
back.
taking my phone call.
Of course, happy to
thank you for
talk to
taking
you.
my call. Okay, so because he's at it again, I'm at it again, and that is asking you the same question I asked you, 2-3 months ago? Is he going into Mexico? Because he just said it this past week. I lost track. I'm going to make it short and sweet. I lost track where or when or how these distractions. It's a distraction after a distraction after a distraction. It started all with Epstein, then it went to Venezuela and Iran. Now you got this thing that he said last week that he's not ruling out sending troops into Mexico. So where are you at? How can you tell what this knucklehead, what this narcissist is going to do? I don't think anybody knows, even you, Double E. So that's where I finished the question to you.
I appreciate the question. I agree with you. We can't know. However, no, he is not going into Mexico. Although he did, sort of. I mean, he did. They did indict a mayor. They did. They are taking, but they will not militarily invade. Look, they are weird. This Iran fiasco is such a humbling experience for these people. Pete Hegseth gets up on that podium, foams at the mouth, lies to America, yells at people, and can't get his act together. Secretary of State Rubio says, we have this new initiative. It's called Project Open the Gulf in 4 minutes, and we're standing by it forever. And Donald Trump tweets 2 minutes later, we're not doing that. I mean, they entirely are the incompetence of this administration, coupled with the lethality of the military, is a dangerous thing. And they have so screwed it up for the whole world that I just don't think, good, you know what? I don't want them to invade Mexico. God, I don't want them to invade Mexico. But if they are that stupid, they'll lose 50 states.
And what about Cuba? While we're at it, while we're in the neighborhood of Mexico, what about Cuba? You know what I'm saying? Like I said before, he thought he was going to have it easy in Iran because of Venezuela. Because this power trip that he's got goes to his head. That's obvious. But he thought it was going to be easy in Iran. And look, he constantly, that's why they call him a taco, because he constantly takes it back, because Iran is not Venezuela. Venezuela is not Mexico. Mexico, like I said, he's going to have a hard time in Mexico if he does this crazy stuff.
He's not.
But
and even the Republicans in Congress will stop that. That is just a suicide pact for them. But again, and I say this because part of me still lives in a sane world. I put nothing. If he thought he could get away with it, of course he would do it.
Yeah, well, he's got one thing going for him: the fact that he's had this Mexico thing with the cartels running. How many months has he been? Maybe a year or more. Mentioning the fact that the cartels, and that's one of the prime reasons that he wants to go into Mexico, and it's even affecting the president because there's traitors in Mexico. I don't know if you heard. There's senator, there's a governor in the north state of Chihuahua that took money. There's been the CIA intervention in that particular state of Chihuahua. I believe 2 of them died, 2 U.S. CIA that died. So, he's going to look for any excuse. That's obvious. But,
Yeah.
So,
Well, and we, you know what? But I'm giving, to quote Mr. Hegseth, it's time to give them no quarter. When they screw up, I'm sorry, we're not bailing them out anymore. We're going to point it out.
yeah.
All right, Roosevelt.
Thank you.
I got one more caller to squeeze in.
Go ahead. Thank you, Double E.
You bet. All right, Brian, we're going to finish us off today. What's on your mind and where are you calling from?
I'm in Albuquerque. I used to live in Chicagoland, but now I'm out here.
Okay.
I've been listening to this time slot since Dick Kay had it.
Yeah.
A lot of great conversations today, and I think, the big issue is how are average, everyday Americans going to afford to live their lives now? I mean, we have these massive dark clouds on our political horizon or the world's horizon with AI and the climate. I think both of these things are going to drastically affect the job market and just where people are living and their whole lives, basically. And, Trump's in the White House because of political failures. I think the Democrats would gain if they would admit the failures they've made and right the ship and tell how things are going to be different. Because, I heard your first speaker, and it's like, I think if Dems just keep beating the drum of racism constantly, it's a loser. Middle America is sick of hearing about racism. You think about some of the most beloved, popular people in the United States, Barack Obama, Beyonce, LeBron James. The list goes on and on and on. They're beloved by everybody. There's always going to be racism. There always has been, just like sexism. Since people walked out of Africa, there's been racism. It's just like, let's let it die. It's over. It's just like if I had a Russian neighbor and a German neighbor, and they were always mad about World War II all the time. It's like, it's over. Let's move ahead. Now, let's look at the reality of we have half of America operating at the sixth grade level as far as reading and math skills. And what we've learned from globalization is that an average American with a sixth grade education isn't worth very much. That's what globalization has showed us, as well as how the smart guys on Wall Street vacuum up all the wealth, and wealth concentrates. Those have been the huge problems, and our parties just can't deal with it, or they don't want to get rid of the old playbook and start focusing on how average people are going to live in this country 50 years from now. There's no talk of the future. We keep wanting to rehash the past, retell the past. Yeah, human history is horrible. It's full of horror stories. And it's how do we move ahead? And nobody's painting a picture of what the future is going to be and where America needs to improve to meet it.
You and many people agree on that. I'm not sure I do, because when I hear candidates talk about what they want to do, the rest of the time we're all in negative mode. But when the candidates are out there, and then you listen to them when they get elected, whether it's the governors of New Jersey or Virginia or the mayor of New York, when they were always talking about exactly what you want. They had different answers for sure, but they were talking about like what kind of a future we have and who's it for and how do people get to be part of it. So I think that you're absolutely right. It has to be a more forceful part of our message to everybody. What are we going to do to make the American dream available to everybody, to make everybody part of this, and really everybody, not a subset, not, as you say, some people here, I'm focused on racism means I'm not focused on everybody else. Okay, we can do both things at a time. You can't be a country that denies 40% of its population rights and solve everybody's problems. You actually have to solve everybody's problems. And I agree with that, and people are campaigning on it. I urge you to listen to the guys who are running for office, whether it's for school boards across the country or governors. We are hearing it, and I believe we will hear it in the next presidential race. You have to listen carefully because the captured media drowns it out.
I agree with you there. It's going to be a fascinating era the next 2.5 years we live through, and hopefully it works out for the best. Thanks for allowing me to speak, Edwin. Great show.
No, thank you, Brian. And I'm going to leave you guys all with this. The great engineer Buckminster Fuller, who spent his career here in Illinois, he said, whether it is to be utopia or oblivion will be a touch and go relay race up to the final moment. Humanity is in final exam as to whether or not it qualifies for continued existence in the universe. Right? And that was, about a generation and a half ago. So here we are. We're in a very dangerous moment, a precipice, as I called it at the beginning, but we don't have to fall in. We do not. We have to recognize it for what it is and stand together, all of us, and we'll be okay. Talk to you next week, everybody. Thanks for joining me.